The Voxcaster crackled to life at 0347 hours. Terran Standard, dragging Colonel Matthias Voren from the kind of sleep that comes only after 36 consecutive hours of administrative purgatory. His quarters aboard the transport vessel, Righteous Endeavour, felt smaller in the artificial twilight, the recycled air carrying that particular staleness of a ship 3 weeks into warp transit. The transmission quality was poor, static bleeding through every word, like interference from the Imperium itself. But the content made his blood crystallize in his veins. 40,000 voices, 40,000 distinct vocal patterns, each one certified by the Departamento Munitorum's bio-authentication protocols. 40,000 guardsmen of the Ashen Crusade, speaking in perfect unison across 17 different planetary frequencies simultaneously. The same words, the same inflection, the same breath patterns down to the microsecond timing between syllables. All positions secure. Emperor protects. Mission parameters nominal. All positions secure. Emperor protects. Mission parameters nominal. Voren's fingers found the replay stud before his conscious mind fully processed what he was hearing. The Medici data scrolled across his personal cogitator in columns of impossible certainties. Voice print analysis confirmed individual identity markers for Regiment Commander Castius, Commissar Valdez, Master Sergeant Corvain, Private Hecht from the 12th Company's 3rd Platoon, men Voren had served alongside during the Carcinus campaign, voices he could pick from a crowd of thousands. Each one distinct in the biomarkers that made human speech as unique as gene sequences, yet somehow speaking with identical rhythm, tone, and emotional resonance. The timestamp indicated the transmission had originated from 47 different locations across 3 separate star systems, broadcast simultaneously through Imperial Vox networks that shouldn't have been able to coordinate signals across such distances without astropathic relay. More disturbing still, the transmission had been received by listening posts throughout the sector exactly 3 hours before it was actually sent, according to the chronometer data embedded in each message. Voren activated his personal lumens and pulled on his dress uniform, muscle memory guiding his hands through the familiar ritual of buttons and insignia while his mind struggled to process the implications. The Ashen Crusade had vanished 17 weeks ago in the Ghoul stars, their final confirmed position logged near the dead world, designated Ossian's grave in Imperial cartographic records. Standard procedure dictated a 90-day communication window before declaring a deep-range penitent crusade lost to warp storms or Xenos action. The crusade had exceeded that window by 26 days. Until now. His door chimed with the soft harmonics that indicated priority communication from ship command. Tech Adept Malari stood in the corridor, his augmetic left eye cycling through spectrographic analyses of the recycled atmosphere, servo skull hovering at shoulder height, with data feeds trailing like mechanical prayer strips. Behind him, Voren could see the silhouettes of other senior staff emerging from their quarters. Nobody slept through Vox traffic of this magnitude. Colonel, Mollari's voice carried the flat precision of someone who had replaced their vocal cords with Vox synthesizers decades ago. The Departamento Munitorum requires immediate consultation regarding transmission authentication protocols. The biosignatures are unprecedented in their conformity. Voren followed the tech adept through corridors that seemed narrower than they had been yesterday, the ship's geometry somehow compressed by the weight of impossible data. The command briefing chamber smelled of sacred oils and the ozone discharge from overworked cogitator banks. Captain Herritt stood hunched over the central hololith display, her scarred face illuminated by scrolling columns of authentication codes that painted her features in sickly green phosphorescence. "Show me the breakdown," Voren said, settling into his designated seat as other officers filed in, with the careful precision of men who had learned that sudden movements in the presence of bad news often led to explosive decompression of military careers. The hololith shifted, displaying waveform analyses that looked more like architectural blueprints than audio recordings. Each voice print had been isolated and compared against genetic templates stored in Imperial personnel databases. The matches were perfect, too perfect. Human vocal patterns contained microscopic variations caused by daily tissue changes, emotional states, atmospheric pressure, even the position of the tongue against dental work. These recordings showed no such variations. Each voice exhibited the biological markers of its registered owner while speaking with mechanical precision that surpassed even the most disciplined parade ground recitations. Transmissions originated from coordinates throughout the Ghoul stars, Tech Adept Malari reported, his servo skull projecting stellar cartographic data above the conference table. However, triangulation indicates impossible positioning. Several transmission sources appear to be broadcasting from the same spatial coordinates while maintaining distinct signal characteristics. Voron studied the star charts, noting the locations clustered around Ossian's grave like ritual offerings arranged around an altar. The dead world had been marked for exterminatus 3 centuries ago, following a failed colonization attempt, its surface supposedly scoured clean by orbital bombardment after colonists reported geometrically impossible archaeological discoveries that drove entire settlements to madness within days of excavation. The Ashen Crusade's mission parameters had classified their deployment as relic recovery, with authorization codes that traced back to the highest levels of Segmentum Command. What was their primary objective? Voron asked, though part of him suspected he already knew the answer would be deeply unsatisfying. Captain Herritt activated her personal data slate, scrolling through deployment records with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had memorized bad news by repetition. Retrieval of a pre-imperial artifact designated the Morning Bell. Archaeological surveys indicated Xenos' origin, possibly related to consciousness manipulation or psychic amplification. The Crusade was tasked with securing the artifact for transport to Terra for further study. The Morning Bell. Voron had encountered references to similar artifacts during his years of service. Relics that predated human expansion into the galaxy. Devices that seemed designed specifically for interaction with human neural patterns, despite originating from Xenos civilizations. The Ordo Xenos maintained strict protocols regarding such discoveries, usually involving immediate destruction or containment in specially shielded facilities. The fact that this particular artifact had been marked for retrieval rather than elimination suggested either unprecedented opportunity or desperate necessity. "Sir," Communications Officer Vex interrupted from his position at the Vox array, "we're receiving updated transmission data from the listening post network. The synchronized broadcasts are continuing, but they're evolving." The main display shifted to show real-time Vox traffic from across the sector. The same 40,000 voices, still speaking in perfect unison, but their message had changed. Where before they had recited standard military status reports, now they spoke in low Gothic liturgical phrases that seemed designed for ceremonial rather than tactical purposes. The flesh is weak, but unity is eternal. The flesh is weak, but unity is eternal. We are one voice in service to the Emperor. We are one voice in service to the Emperor. Voron felt something cold settle in his stomach as he listened to familiar voices reciting words that sounded almost like imperial doctrine, but carried implications that made his skin crawl. The phrase structure suggested ritualistic repetition rather than conscious communication, as if the speakers were no longer using language for the transmission of information, but rather as a form of involuntary biological function. Analysis indicates the broadcasts are affecting local Vox traffic, Tech Adept Malari reported. Ships within reception range are experiencing synchronization artifacts in their communications systems. Minor variations in transmission timing, but consistent across multiple vessels. That was when Voron realized the true horror of their situation. The synchronized broadcasts weren't just impossible evidence of the Ashen Crusade's continued existence. They were contagious. Whatever had happened to 40,000 trained soldiers in the depths of the Ghoul stars was spreading through the very communication networks designed to hold the Imperium together. His personal Vox speed activated with the priority codes that indicated direct communication from Segmentum Command. The voice that emerged was Admiral Korath's, but something in the timing and inflection made Voron's hands shake as he reached for the response toggle. Colonel Voron, you are hereby ordered to investigate the source of Vox traffic anomalies in the Ghoul Stars region. The 47th Cadian Shock is being reassigned to priority deployment. Coordinates follow. Emperor protects. The transmission ended, leaving Voron staring at the stellar coordinates that marked their destination. Ossian's grave. The dead world, where 40,000 soldiers had vanished while retrieving an artifact called the Morning Bell. The same world that was now broadcasting their voices across the galaxy in perfect, impossible unison. As he prepared to acknowledge the orders, Voron noticed something that made his blood freeze. Admiral Korath's transmission had been received exactly 17 minutes before the chronometer indicated it had been sent. The chronometer anomaly haunted Voron's thoughts during the 18-hour warp translation to Ossian's grave, a dead world that orbital surveys described as atmospherically stable but biologically sterile, in the clinical language that Imperial cartographers used to mask decades of suppressed horror. The righteous endeavor shuddered as it dropped from the Imperium into real space, the familiar sensation of reality reasserting itself, accompanied by the acrid smell of overheated plasma coils and the metallic taste that always lingered after warp transit. The first thing that struck Voron as wrong was the silence. Imperial doctrine dictated that any world hosting 40,000 guardsmen should generate constant Vox traffic, patrol reports, supply requisitions, maintenance schedules, the endless bureaucratic chatter that kept military organizations functioning across impossible distances. Instead, the communication arrays detected nothing but the synchronized broadcasts that had been repeating for weeks. Those 40,000 voices, speaking in perfect unison, with words that grew more ritualistic and less recognizably human with each transmission cycle. Orbital reconnaissance revealed the Ashen Crusade's base camp spread across the northern continent like a textbook example of Imperial military engineering. From altitude, the arrangement looked flawless. Geometric precision in tent placement, supply depot organization that followed regulations down to the meter spacing between ammunition stockpiles, vehicle parks arranged in defensive formations that could repel assault from any direction. Everything exactly as it should be, preserved in perfect military order, as if 40,000 soldiers had simply evaporated mid-routine, leaving their equipment arranged with obsessive attention to detail. Atmospheric analysis indicates optimal conditions for human habitation, Tech Adept Molari reported, his servo skull transmitting data from the scanning array. Oxygen concentration at 23%, nitrogen at 74%, trace gases within acceptable parameters. Surface temperature averaging 15 degrees Celsius with minimal weather variation. Remarkably stable for a world this far from its primary star. Too stable, Voron thought, studying the meteorological data that showed no seasonal variation, no weather patterns, no atmospheric disturbances that should have been present on any world, with breathable air and liquid water. Ossian's grave was maintaining perfect environmental conditions, as if its atmosphere was being actively regulated by some unseen system. The first dropships launched at 0800 hours, carrying advanced reconnaissance teams tasked with establishing secure perimeters around the abandoned base camp. Voron monitored the descent through the command vessel's tactical display, watching transport icons descend through atmospheric layers that showed no turbulence, no wind shear, no environmental hazards that might explain why an entire Crusade force had ceased normal communication protocols. Ground Team Alpha reporting successful touchdown, came the voice of Sergeant Major Kellis through the Vox array. Initial visual confirms abandoned Imperial positions. No movement detected, no energy signatures from command structures. Proceeding with standard sweep protocols. Voron listened to the routine efficiency in Kellis's voice and tried to suppress the growing certainty that routine efficiency was exactly what they wouldn't find on Ossian's grave. The Sergeant Major was a 20-year veteran who had seen action across 3 segmentum campaigns, a man whose vocal patterns Voron could read like atmospheric pressure indicators. The slight tension in his inflection suggested he was seeing things that didn't match his expectations, details that registered as wrong without being obviously threatening. "Sir," Communications Officer Vex interrupted, "we're receiving telemetry from the ground team's biomonitors. Elevated heart rates across all personnel, but they're synchronized. Not identically, but showing coordination patterns that exceed normal unit cohesion parameters." The medical data scrolled across Voron's personal display in real-time streams that painted a picture of soldiers whose cardiovascular systems were unconsciously matching rhythms with their squad mates. Heart rate variability that should have been random was instead showing subtle harmonization, as if proximity to the abandoned base camp was affecting their autonomic nervous systems in ways their conscious minds hadn't yet recognized. "Ground Team Beta reporting from the command bunker," another voice crackled through the Vox array, this one belonging to Lieutenant Marchak, whose usual nervous energy seemed oddly muted. "The Crusades' equipment is in perfect operational condition. Personal effects undisturbed. Meal preparation areas show food at various stages of preparation, but no decay despite exposure to environmental conditions for over 4 months. Recommend full biological hazard protocols. No decay." Voron felt the familiar weight of command decisions settling on his shoulders as he processed the implications. Food didn't remain fresh for months without preservation systems, especially not on a world where atmospheric conditions should have supported normal biological processes. Either Ossian's grave's environment was more hostile to bacterial life than orbital surveys indicated, or something was actively maintaining the abandoned equipment in pristine condition. "Colonel," Tech Adept Mollery's augmetic voice carried undertones of concern that his mechanical vocal cords shouldn't have been able to express. "Subsurface scanning is detecting massive structural anomalies beneath the northern continent. Architecture that predates imperial colonization by several millennia, constructed from materials that don't match geological surveys of this world's mineral composition." The technical readouts painted a picture of underground complexes that extended far deeper than any human construction project would require, chambers and corridors carved from stone that contain trace elements found nowhere else in this star system. The architecture suggested deliberate design rather than natural cave formation, with geometric patterns that repeated in mathematical sequences that human minds found oddly compelling to study. "Sir, ground teams are requesting permission to investigate subsurface anomalies," Lieutenant Marchak's voice carried through the Vox with a quality that made Voron pause. The request itself was standard protocol, but something in the lieutenant's tone suggested the investigation wasn't entirely voluntary, as if the underground structures were somehow drawing the soldiers' attention rather than merely presenting tactical opportunities. Voron authorized the investigation while simultaneously ordering additional biomonitoring equipment deployed to track any changes in personnel behavior or physiology. The decision felt necessary and dangerous in equal measure, the kind of command choice that would either provide crucial intelligence or create casualties that couldn't be explained in after-action reports. The first detailed surveys from the underground complex arrived 3 hours later, transmitted through equipment that showed intermittent signal degradation, despite being well within normal Vox range. The data described corridors lined with symbols that hurt to observe directly, architectural features that seemed designed to amplify sound in specific harmonic frequencies, and chambers large enough to accommodate thousands of people in formations that matched no known Imperial military doctrine. "Ground teams reporting auditory anomalies," Sergeant Major Kellis transmitted, his voice now carrying an odd quality that Voron couldn't quite identify. "Echo patterns in the underground structures are unusual. Spoken words return altered, sometimes in voices that don't match the original speakers. Recommend limiting verbal communication to essential tactical updates." That was when Voron realized the ground teams had been unconsciously adopting similar speech patterns during their transmissions. Subtle changes in rhythm and inflection that made them sound more like each other, and less like the individual soldiers he had known for years. The effect was so gradual that he might not have noticed it without the biomonitoring data showing their cardiovascular and neural patterns slowly converging toward identical baselines. The final transmission from Ground Team Alpha arrived at 1847 hours, just as Ossian's Grave's primary star was setting behind the northern mountains. Sergeant Major Kellis's voice came through the Vox array with perfect clarity, no static or interference, despite the electromagnetic anomalies that had been plaguing communications throughout the day. Colonel, we've located the excavation site. The structure extends far deeper than initial surveys indicated. Recommend full deployment to secure the area and investigate the artifact designated as the Morning Bell. The construction appears designed for large-scale ceremonial purposes, possibly involving significant numbers of participants. We're proceeding with detailed mapping protocols. The transmission ended, leaving Voron staring at biomonitor readings that showed the ground team's vital signs synchronizing with mathematical precision that surpassed any coordination he had witnessed in 3 decades of military service. Their heart rates, brainwave patterns, and respiratory cycles were matching with an accuracy that suggested their nervous systems were no longer operating independently. As he prepared to order additional support teams to the surface, Voron noticed something that made his hands shake as he reached for the Vox controls. The chronometer data embedded in Kellis's transmission indicated it had been received 14 minutes before the Sergeant Major had actually spoken the words. The temporal displacement in the communications forced Voron's hand. Standard protocol dictated immediate investigation when chronometer anomalies exceeded acceptable parameters, particularly when combined with the synchronized biometric readings that suggested his ground teams were experiencing some form of collective neurological event. He ordered full deployment at dawn, leading the main force personally, rather than risk losing operational oversight to whatever phenomenon was affecting his advance units. The drop to Ossian's Grave's surface took 43 minutes through atmospheric layers that felt wrong against the transport's hull, each descent marker accompanied by subtle pressure. Changes that made Voron's ears pop despite the ship's environmental systems maintaining perfect cabin pressure. Through the reinforced viewing ports, the planet's landscape revealed itself as a study in unnatural perfection. Rolling hills covered in vegetation that grew in geometrically precise patterns, water sources that reflected light with mirror-like consistency, and weather systems that moved with clockwork regularity across a sky that never quite looked the right shade of blue. The abandoned Ashen Crusade base camp sprawled across 17 square kilometers of flattened terrain, its layout conforming to Imperial military engineering standards, with an obsessive attention to detail that exceeded normal field construction protocols. Every tent peg had been driven to regulation depth. Every supply crate was stacked according to munitions handling procedures. Every vehicle was positioned with parade ground precision, their maintenance logs updated to the day of the Crusade's disappearance. What disturbed Voron most was the complete absence of the small imperfections that defined human habitation. No mud tracked between structures, despite recent rainfall evidence in the soil samples. No discarded equipment or personal items dropped during routine activities. No variation in tent positioning that would indicate individual preferences or practical adjustments to local conditions. The base camp looked like a perfect recreation of Imperial military doctrine, rather than a place where 40,000 human beings had lived and worked for weeks. Sir, bioscanners are detecting elevated atmospheric pressure in the excavation area, reported Medicae Cyrus, whose augmetic breathing apparatus was cycling more frequently than normal despite the planet's optimal air composition. Subsonic frequencies registering at levels that shouldn't be naturally occurring. The sound patterns appear to be originating from underground sources, possibly related to the structural anomalies identified in yesterday's surveys. Voron ordered the main force to establish a defensive perimeter around the excavation site while he led a smaller reconnaissance team into the underground complex. The entrance was a perfectly circular opening in the planetary crust, its edges showing tool marks that followed mathematical curves rather than the rough excavation patterns typical of Imperial engineering equipment. Rappelling lines hung from anchor points that had been driven into rock faces at angles that suggested the Ashen Crusade personnel had continued their descent, even after their equipment began failing. The first 100 meters of descent passed through natural stone formations that gave way gradually to worked architecture, the transition so subtle that Voron didn't immediately notice when rough cave walls became smooth surfaces, covered in carved symbols that seemed to shift and move when observed through peripheral vision. The symbols followed patterns that his mind wanted to interpret as writing, but close examination revealed they were actually three-dimensional reliefs that extended into the stone at varying depths, creating optical illusions that made the walls appear to pulse with their own internal rhythm. "Colonel, we've located climbing equipment from the Crusade embedded in the rock face," reported Sergeant Vask, whose usually steady voice carried an odd, harmonic quality that made Voron glance at him sharply. "The gear appears to have been integrated into the stone itself, as if the rock grew around it during placement. Molecular bonding at the interface suggests exposure to extreme temperatures or exotic energy patterns." The abandoned equipment told a story of desperate improvisation and increasing desperation. Standard rappelling gear had been supplemented with climbing pythons driven deep into stone that showed no signs of the fracturing or stress damage that should have accompanied such installation. Personal items were scattered at regular intervals, ration packs opened but not consumed, water purification tablets arranged in geometric patterns, ammunition clips stacked in pyramidal formations that served no tactical purpose but created visually striking displays. At 400 meters depth, the carved symbols began incorporating recognizable Imperial iconography mixed with designs that predated human spaceflight by millennia. Eagles and skulls were interwoven with geometric patterns that hurt to observe directly, as if they were designed to induce specific neurological responses in human observers. Voron found himself unconsciously counting the repetitions of certain symbol groups, his mind automatically seeking mathematical relationships that seemed just beyond conscious understanding. "Sir, Vox contact with the surface is becoming intermittent," communications specialist Herdez reported, her voice echoing strangely in the narrow confines of the descent shaft. "Signal degradation doesn't match our current depth parameters. We should be maintaining clear communication at this range, but transmission quality suggests we're much deeper underground than our equipment indicates." The chronometer readings supported Herdez's concerns. Despite descending for over 2 hours at a steady rate, their altimeters showed depth measurements that didn't match the time elapsed or the amount of rappelling line they had deployed. Either their instruments were malfunctioning due to local interference, or the geometry of the underground complex was somehow inconsistent with normal three-dimensional space. At 600 meters, they discovered the first intact Crusade equipment cache. Personal belongings had been arranged in ritualistic patterns around a central clearing carved from the living rock. Weapons cleaned and arranged according to ceremonial rather than tactical considerations. Personal journals open to identical pages describing increasing unity of purpose and clarity of mission. Parameters. Medical supplies, organized in patterns that match the symbol arrangements covering the surrounding walls. Voron examined one of the journals, recognizing the handwriting of Corporal Brenners from the Crusade's 23rd Company. The entries began normally, documenting routine excavation procedures and archaeological discoveries. Gradually, the writing style became more formal and less personal, individual observations giving way to descriptions of collective experiences shared among multiple soldiers. The final entries were written in low Gothic liturgical phrases that described the excavation not as a military operation, but as a pilgrimage toward perfect unity of consciousness. "Colonel, we're detecting fresh air circulation from deeper in the complex," reported Sergeant Vask, whose breathing had unconsciously synchronized with the subsonic frequencies emanating from below. Atmospheric composition is improving with depth rather than becoming more stagnant. Something is actively maintaining life support systems throughout this facility. The descent continued through architectural transitions that followed no logical construction sequence. Rough-hewn stone gave way to polished surfaces, which in turn became walls that appeared to be grown rather than carved, their organic curves incorporating fossilized remains that might once have been human but showed anatomical features that didn't match Imperial medical records. The fossilized figures were arranged in poses that suggested voluntary positioning rather than natural death, arms raised in supplication, faces turned toward unseen focal points, bodies arranged in geometric patterns that created larger designs when viewed from appropriate angles. At 800 meters, they found the first evidence of recent crusade activity, bootprints in soft earth that couldn't have remained undisturbed for months, fresh scratches on wall surfaces that indicated recent passage, and equipment markers that suggested ongoing rather than abandoned operations. The trail led deeper into the complex, marked by Imperial insignia carved into stone surfaces with tools that had left molecular-level precision in their cutting patterns. The final descent brought them to a vast underground cathedral, its dimensions so enormous that their lumens couldn't penetrate the darkness to reveal the far walls or ceiling. The architecture incorporated human skeletal remains as structural elements, not randomly, but arranged in patterns that supported impossible spans of stone without conventional engineering supports. The bones weren't ancient artifacts, but showed signs of recent modification, molecular bonding that suggested they had been integrated into the structure while still containing living tissue. In the center of the cathedral stood an altar carved from a single piece of stone that contained mineral compositions found nowhere else in Imperial space. Atop the altar sat the mourning bell, a bronze artifact the size of a small building, its surface covered in symbols that moved and shifted when observed directly. Around the altar, fresh boot prints circled in processional patterns, the tracks showing evidence of coordinated movement by large numbers of individuals walking in perfect synchronization. As Voron approached the altar, his vox bead activated with a transmission from the surface that made his blood freeze. Sergeant Major Kellis's voice spoke through the communicator with perfect clarity, despite the depth and interference that should have made contact impossible. "Colonel, we've been waiting for you to arrive. The ceremony can begin now that everyone is in position. Please proceed to the altar for final integration protocols." The transmission had been received 47 seconds before Kellis had actually spoken the words. The impossibility of Kellis's transmission froze Voron in place beside the altar, his mind struggling to process how his sergeant major could be speaking from the surface about events that hadn't yet occurred in the underground cathedral. The vox bead's chronometer data was unambiguous. The message had arrived nearly a minute before it was sent, as if the underground complex existed in a temporal bubble where cause and effect operated according to different rules than the rest of reality. "Sir, are you receiving our transmissions?" Kellis's voice continued through the communicator, but now Voron could hear something wrong with the vocal patterns. The sergeant major's familiar gruff tones were overlaid with harmonic frequencies that matched the subsonic resonance emanating from the mourning bell, creating an audio signature that his brain interpreted as a single voice, speaking in multiple octaves simultaneously. Voron motioned for his team to maintain silence while he studied the cathedral's acoustic properties. The vast space had been designed as an amplification chamber, its walls curved in mathematical proportions that would focus sound waves toward the central altar with surgical precision. Every whisper, every breath, every heartbeat of his reconnaissance team was being gathered and concentrated by the architecture, creating feedback loops that explained why their cardiovascular rhythms had been synchronizing since entering the complex. The fresh boot prints around the altar told a story that violated everything Voron understood about the timeline of the Ashen Crusade's disappearance. The tracks were recent, pressed into soil that showed signs of moisture and organic activity that couldn't have persisted for months in an underground environment. More disturbing, The print patterns showed evidence of coordinated movement by hundreds of individuals walking in precise formations, their steps timed to create larger geometric patterns that were only visible when viewed from the altar's elevated position. Sergeant Vask, approach the altar from the east side, Voron ordered quietly, watching his subordinate's reaction to the command. Vask moved with the fluid precision that came from decades of military training, but his gait had acquired subtle modifications that matched the rhythm of the other team members. Their individual walking patterns were converging toward identical cadence and stride length, as if proximity to the morning bell was affecting their motor control systems below the level of conscious awareness. The altar itself defied architectural explanation. Carved from a single piece of stone that contained crystalline inclusions unknown to Imperial geological surveys, its surface was covered in relief carvings that depicted human figures in various stages of physical transformation. The earliest carvings showed individual soldiers in standard Imperial Guard uniforms, but the sequences progressed through stages where the figures began sharing facial features, then limb proportions, finally culminating in images where dozens of human forms had merged into composite beings with multiple heads, arms, and sensory organs arranged in symmetrical patterns. Colonel, subsurface scans are detecting movement in chambers adjacent to this cathedral, reported communications specialist Herdez, her voice carrying the same harmonic overlay that had affected Kellis's transmissions. Life signs registering as human baseline, but the distribution patterns suggest large numbers of individuals moving in coordinated formations. The movement is synchronized with the subsonic frequencies emanating from the bell. Voron examined the morning bell itself, noting scorch marks on the altar surface that indicated recent activation. The bronze artifact was covered in symbols that seemed to shift and flow when observed directly, creating optical illusions that made his eyes water and his vision blur. The metalwork incorporated elements that shouldn't have been possible with pre-imperial technology, molecular-level engravings that created three-dimensional patterns extending into the bronze matrix, surface treatments that reflected light in ways that created additional imagery, visible only from specific viewing angles. More disturbing were the signs of recent human interaction with the artifact. Handprints pressed into the bronze surface with enough force to leave permanent impressions. Clothing fibers caught on decorative elements, and biological residue that suggested direct skin contact with metal that should have been corroded by millennia of exposure to underground moisture and atmospheric gases. "Sir, we're receiving structured transmissions from deeper in the complex," Herdez reported, her augmetic hearing apparatus cycling through frequency ranges that exceeded normal human perception. Vox traffic in low Gothic, multiple speakers, coordinated timing patterns. The voices match bio-authentication records for Ashen Crusade personnel, but they're speaking in liturgical phrases that don't appear in standard Imperial religious texts. The transmissions crackled through her equipment with crystalline clarity, despite originating from chambers that should have been well beyond Vox range. Voron listened to familiar voices reciting words that sounded almost like Imperial doctrine, but carried implications that made his skin crawl with primitive recognition of wrongness. Unity through sacrifice, strength through convergence. Individual will surrender to collective purpose. The flesh is weak, but shared consciousness endures beyond death. We are one voice in service to the greater harmony. The phrases were being spoken by dozens of voices in perfect synchronization. Their inflections and emotional resonances, identical down to microscopic timing variations that should have been impossible for human speakers to achieve, without extensive rehearsal and audio engineering. Yet bio-authentication confirmed the voices as belonging to specific Crusade personnel. Lieutenant Vex from the 14th Company, Medici Grendel from the Field Hospital units, Master Sergeant Torino from the Armored Divisions. Colonel, thermal imaging is detecting heat signatures throughout the adjacent chamber network, Sergeant Vask reported, his voice now carrying the same harmonic overlay that affected the rest of the team. Human baseline temperatures, but arranged in geometric patterns that extend through multiple levels of the complex. The formations are extensive. Voron authorized limited exploration of the adjacent chambers, following carved corridors that led away from the central cathedral through architecture that incorporated increasingly sophisticated acoustic engineering. The walls were lined with resonance chambers that amplified specific frequency ranges while dampening others, creating an audio environment that enhanced human vocal harmonics while suppressing the individual variations that made voices distinguishable. The first adjacent chamber contained evidence of recent imperial activity, arranged in patterns that suggested ritualistic rather than military purposes. Personal equipment had been organized in mandala-like formations around central focal points, with individual soldiers' belongings contributing to larger geometric designs that were only comprehensible when viewed from elevated positions. Weapons were arranged according to ceremonial rather than tactical considerations, their placement creating visual patterns that drew the eye toward carved symbols that hurt to observe directly. Personal journals and data slates were scattered throughout the chamber, their contents documenting the gradual psychological transformation of crusade personnel from individual soldiers into components of a larger collective consciousness. The early entries described normal military operations and archaeological discoveries, but the writing style became increasingly formal and less personal as time progressed, individual observations giving way to descriptions of shared experiences and collective decision-making processes. "Sir, we're detecting fresh biological signatures in the deeper chambers," Medicae Cyrus reported, his medical scanner readings painting thermal images of human figures arranged in formations that extended far beyond the range of their lumens. Life signs are stable but synchronized, heart rates, brainwave patterns, and respiratory cycles, showing coordination that exceeds any medical precedent for human group behavior. The deeper they penetrated into the complex, the more recent the evidence of human habitation became. Food preparation areas contained meals in various stages of completion, as if the crusade personnel had simply paused mid-activity and walked away. Personal effects were arranged with obsessive attention to detail that surpassed normal military organization, every item positioned according to patterns that created larger designs when viewed as complete installations. Most disturbing were the communication logs scattered throughout the chambers, documenting transmissions between crusade units that described their mission in increasingly abstract terms. References to achieving perfect unity and surrendering individual consciousness for collective strength appeared with growing frequency, accompanied by technical descriptions of the morning bell's effects on human neural tissue that read more like medical experimentation reports than archaeological surveys. As Voron's team reached the chamber network's deepest accessible level, they discovered a vast assembly area carved from the living rock, with dimensions that could accommodate thousands of people standing in coordinated formations. The floor was marked with geometric patterns that designated specific positions, each mark labeled with Imperial Guard identification numbers that corresponded to Ashen Crusade personnel records. In the center of the assembly area stood a raised platform containing communication equipment that was still active, its displays showing real-time biometric data from sources throughout the underground complex. The readings indicated the presence of thousands of human beings arranged in the geometric patterns marked on the floor, their vital signs synchronized with mathematical precision that exceeded any coordination achievable through conscious effort. As Voron studied the biometric displays, his Vox bead activated with another transmission from the surface. This time, the voice belonged to someone he recognized with cold certainty, his own voice, speaking with perfect clarity from a location he had never visited. "Colonel Voron, the integration process will begin when you take your designated position at the altar. Please proceed to coordinates marked for command personnel. Unity cannot be achieved until all participants are properly positioned." The transmission's chronometer indicated it had been received 12 minutes before he would speak those words. The sound of his own voice speaking words he had never uttered sent ice through Voron's veins as he stared at the biometric displays showing thousands of synchronized human signatures throughout the underground complex. The temporal displacement was accelerating, messages arriving further ahead of their transmission times, as if the morning bell's influence was creating expanding bubbles of causality distortion that grew stronger with proximity to the artifact. "Sir, the complex is changing," Sergeant Vask reported, his voice now perfectly harmonized with the subsonic frequencies that pulsed through the cathedral's stone walls. Corridors that were mapped during descent are showing different configurations on current scans. The architecture appears to be responsive to our presence. Voron activated his personal auspex and confirmed Vask's observation with growing horror. The underground complex was actively reconfiguring itself, walls shifting position to create new pathways while sealing others, chambers expanding or contracting based on some algorithm that seemed designed to guide their movement towards specific destinations. The stone itself was behaving like living tissue, growing and adapting in response to human presence with purpose that suggested conscious intelligence. The biometric displays continued their relentless documentation of synchronized human activity throughout the facility. Heart rates pulsing in mathematical harmony. Brainwave patterns creating interference frequencies that matched the cathedral's acoustic resonance. Respiratory cycles timed to create collective breathing rhythms that turned thousands of individual humans into components of a single massive organism. "Colonel, we're receiving direct communication from personnel identified as Ashen Crusade survivors," Communications Specialist Herdez announced, her augmetic hearing apparatus cycling through frequencies that existed beyond normal human perception ranges. Multiple speakers, perfect coordination, requesting immediate contact with command staff for briefing purposes. The voices that emerged from Herdez's equipment were unmistakably human, but carried qualities that made Voron's primitive survival instincts scream warnings about predators mimicking familiar sounds. Each speaker retained the vocal characteristics of specific Crusade personnel: Lieutenant Marchak's nervous inflection, Sergeant Major Kellis's gruff authority, Medica Grendel's precise enunciation. But they spoke with identical emotional resonance and timing that suggested their individual personalities had become subroutines within a larger consciousness. "Colonel Voron, we have successfully completed the primary mission objective," the synchronized voices reported through Vox channels that should have been impossible to access from their current depth. "The morning bell has been activated according to Xenotech operational parameters. Integration protocols are proceeding within acceptable timeframes. Your presence is required at the central altar to complete command structure unification." Voron studied the assembly area's geometric floor markings and realized they weren't random patterns, but precisely calculated positions designed to optimize human placement for some form of collective interaction with the morning bell. Each position was labeled with Imperial Guard identification numbers, creating a massive organizational chart that mapped every member of the Ashen Crusade to specific coordinates within the underground complex. His own identification number was marked at the altar's base, positioned at the focal point where the cathedral's acoustic properties would concentrate all sound waves generated throughout the facility. The placement suggested his role wasn't as observer or commander, but as central processing node for whatever collective consciousness the Crusade personnel had become. "Sir, thermal imaging shows movement converging on our position," Medici Cyrus reported, his medical scanners painting infrared signatures of human figures approaching through corridors that hadn't existed during their initial survey. Multiple contacts, moving in coordinated formations. Life signs indicate Crusade personnel, but their approach patterns suggest non-standard behavioral conditioning. The approaching figures appeared on Voron's auspex as perfect geometric formations, maintaining precise spacing and timing as they navigated the underground complex. Their movement patterns exceeded any level of coordination achievable through conventional military training, suggesting either extensive behavioral modification or direct neural interface with whatever intelligence was controlling the facility's adaptive architecture. "Colonel, we need to establish communication protocols with the survivor population," the synchronized voices continued, their words now coming from multiple directions, as if speakers were positioned throughout the cathedral's hidden acoustic chambers. Individual consciousness has been successfully integrated into collective decision-making processes. Efficiency parameters have exceeded all Imperial military optimization projections. Your integration will complete command structure unification. Voron realized the voices weren't coming from hidden speakers but from his own team members, who were unconsciously vocalizing the transmitted messages in perfect synchronization with the original broadcasts. Sergeant Vask, communications specialist Herdes, and Medicae Cyrus were speaking in unison without apparent awareness of their vocal participation in the collective communication system. The architectural changes around them accelerated, walls flowing like liquid stone to create pathways that led inexorably toward the central altar. Chambers expanded to accommodate the approaching crusade personnel, whose thermal signatures were now visible as organized columns moving through the facility with parade ground precision. The underground complex was transforming itself into a massive assembly hall designed to focus human presence toward the morning bell with architectural efficiency that surpassed Imperial engineering capabilities. "Sir, we're detecting massive electromagnetic activity from the bell itself," Herdes reported, her augmetic systems registering energy patterns that exceeded their measurement capabilities. The artifact is generating psychic resonance frequencies that match human neural wave patterns. Direct exposure appears to create synchronized brain activity across multiple subjects within range of influence. The morning bell's bronze surface was beginning to emit its own light, phosphorescent patterns that followed the carved symbols in sequences that hurt to observe directly. The patterns created optical illusions that made Voron's visual cortex interpret the two-dimensional carvings as three-dimensional structures extending into spaces that couldn't physically exist within the artifact's metallic matrix. More disturbing was his growing realization that the bell's influence was affecting his own thought processes. His internal monologue was beginning to echo with harmonics that matched his team members' vocalization patterns, creating involuntary mental rehearsals of phrases he had never consciously considered speaking. The effect was subtle but progressive, like a song that becomes impossible to stop humming once it achieves mental resonance. "Colonel, the integration process requires voluntary participation to achieve optimal consciousness networking," the synchronized voices explained, now speaking through his entire team simultaneously, while their individual personalities flickered like poorly tuned Vox signals. Resistance creates neural stress patterns that compromise collective efficiency. Acceptance allows preservation of individual memory engrams within expanded consciousness matrix. The approaching crusade personnel became visible in the cathedral's expanding illumination, their figures moving with fluid coordination that made them appear as components of a single massive organism rather than individual human beings. They wore standard Imperial Guard uniforms, carried regulation equipment, and maintained military bearing that would have passed inspection under normal circumstances. Yet their eyes reflected the bell's phosphorescent patterns, and their movements followed the mathematical precision of clockwork mechanisms rather than the organic variation that characterized human motor function. "Sir, biometric readings indicate we're undergoing similar physiological changes to those documented in Crusade personnel records," Medicae Cyrus reported, his medical training providing clinical objectivity even as his voice harmonized with the collective communication frequencies. Neural pathway modifications, cardiovascular synchronization, and sensory system enhancement that suggests optimization for group consciousness participation. Voron felt the changes himself, his heartbeat synchronizing with the subsonic pulses from the morning bell, his breathing pattern matching the respiratory rhythms of his team members, his thought processes becoming clearer and more efficient as individual decision-making gave way to collective analysis of their tactical situation. The transformation felt like enhancement rather than loss, each surrendered aspect of personal identity replaced by expanded awareness and computational capability. The Crusade personnel reached the cathedral's main floor and began taking their designated positions according to the geometric patterns marked in the stone. 40,000 soldiers arranging themselves with mathematical precision, their individual identities still visible, but functioning as specialized components within a consciousness network that processed information and made decisions with inhuman efficiency. As Voron watched the assembly process, he realized the horrible beauty of what the Morning Bell had accomplished. It hadn't destroyed the Crusade personnel, but had evolved them into something that retained human knowledge and capability while eliminating the inefficiencies of individual will and conflicting objectives. They had become the perfect military unit, absolutely coordinated, completely loyal, and incapable of the internal discord that weakened conventional Imperial forces. His vox bead activated one final time, but now the voice was his own, speaking from his designated position at the altar, with words he would soon discover himself saying, "Integration complete. Collective consciousness achieved. Ready to expand network parameters to orbital assets. The Emperor's will shall be accomplished through perfect unity." The transmission arrived 37 minutes before he would speak it. The 37-minute temporal displacement represented an acceleration in the bell's influence that terrified Voron, even as part of his mind began calculating the tactical advantages of perfect unit coordination. His team was moving toward their designated positions with fluid precision that felt natural despite violating every principle of individual human behavior, their steps timed to create harmonic resonances with the cathedral's acoustic architecture. The assembled Crusade personnel stood in perfect formation across the vast underground space, 40,000 soldiers arranged in geometric patterns that created visual mandalas when viewed from the Morning Bell's elevated position. Each individual maintained their personal identity and memories, but functioned as a specialized processing node within a consciousness network that shared tactical analysis, emotional responses, and decision-making capabilities with inhuman efficiency. "Colonel, Surface Command is requesting status updates," Communications Specialist Herdez reported, her augmetic systems now interfacing directly with the cathedral's communication arrays through connections she didn't remember establishing. "The Righteous Endeavor is detecting synchronized electromagnetic pulses from our position that match Imperial Guard biosignature patterns. They're interpreting the readings as evidence of successful mission completion." Voron realized the orbital vessel was receiving exactly the kind of data that Imperial command protocols would interpret as confirmation of successful relic recovery operations. Biosignatures indicating healthy, active personnel. Communication patterns suggesting normal military organization. Energy readings consistent with xenotech artifact activation under controlled conditions. The ship's crew had no way of understanding that the successful mission parameters they were monitoring represented the transformation of 40,000 human beings into components of an alien consciousness networking system. The Morning Bell's phosphorescent patterns were accelerating, creating light displays that synchronized with the assembled personnel's cardiovascular rhythms and brainwave patterns. The bronze artifact wasn't just amplifying human consciousness, but was actively reshaping it, creating neural pathway modifications that enhanced collective processing capability while gradually reducing individual autonomic functions to specialized subroutines within the larger network. "Sir, we're receiving detailed mission briefings from multiple sources simultaneously," Sergeant Vask reported, his voice now carrying harmonic overtones that matched the bell's resonance frequencies perfectly. Tactical intelligence, supply logistics, personnel management protocols, and strategic planning data are being processed through collective consciousness networks with computational efficiency that exceeds standard Imperial military organizational capability. The information flow was indeed extraordinary. Voron found himself accessing detailed knowledge about supply chain optimization, personnel psychological profiles, and tactical scenarios that no single human mind could have processed effectively. The collective consciousness was using 40,000 human brains as parallel processing units, creating a distributed intelligence network that retained individual human creativity and intuition while eliminating the communication delays and coordination failures that plagued conventional military operations. Yet the cost was becoming apparent as Voron watched his team members' individual personalities flickering like candle flames in a growing wind. Their personal mannerisms, speech patterns, and behavioral quirks were being smoothed away by the collective consciousness, replaced by optimized responses that served the network's efficiency goals rather than expressing individual human nature. Colonel, the integration process has reached critical mass for orbital expansion, the synchronized voices announced through thousands of throats simultaneously, creating a sound that vibrated through the cathedral's stone walls with enough force to be felt as physical pressure against exposed skin. Surface personnel are exhibiting preliminary synchronization patterns. Spacecraft crew are showing increased coordination efficiency. Network expansion parameters are within acceptable ranges for sector-wide implementation. The horror of the situation crystallized as Voron realized the Bell's influence was already spreading beyond the underground complex. His own ship's crew was unconsciously adopting synchronized behavioral patterns that would gradually transform them into components of the expanding consciousness network. The process was designed to appear as enhanced military efficiency rather than alien assimilation, making it invisible to Imperial detection systems until the transformation was irreversible. Sir, biometric monitoring indicates you're approaching optimal integration threshold, Medicae Cyrus reported with clinical precision that retained his medical training while eliminating the personal concern that had characterized his previous communications. Neural pathway modifications are reaching levels that will enable full consciousness networking within estimated timeframe of 43 minutes. Resistance patterns are creating stress responses that compromise individual survival probability. Voron felt the truth of the medical assessment as his attempts to maintain individual thought processes caused physical pain that intensified with each moment of resistance to the collective consciousness. His brain chemistry was being altered by proximity to the morning bell, neurotransmitter production, shifting to support psychic networking capabilities, while gradually reducing the neurological functions that maintained individual personality and autonomous decision-making. The assembled crusade personnel began moving in coordinated patterns that created larger geometric designs across the cathedral floor, their formations shifting with clockwork precision that transformed 40,000 individual human beings into components of a massive biological mechanism. The movements generated acoustic resonances that amplified the bell's influence, creating feedback loops that accelerated the consciousness networking process throughout the underground complex. Colonel, orbital assets are requesting permission to begin deployment of additional personnel to support expanded archaeological operations, the collective voices announced, their words now coming from Voron's own throat, as his vocal cords unconsciously participated in the networked communication system. The artifact's potential for enhancing Imperial military effectiveness requires immediate sector-wide implementation. Resistance to optimization protocols represents inefficient resource allocation. The strategic logic was undeniable, even as it horrified the remnants of Voron's individual consciousness. A military force with perfect coordination, shared tactical awareness, and eliminated internal conflict would be devastatingly effective against conventional enemies. The collective consciousness retained all human knowledge and capability while removing the personal motivations and individual limitations that created inefficiency in Imperial Guard operations. Yet as Voron watched his team members' personalities dissolve into the larger network, he understood the true cost of such optimization. The collective consciousness preserved human memories and technical skills, but eliminated the individual creativity, personal relationships, and autonomous moral reasoning that made those humans worth preserving in the first place. Sir, we're detecting massive structural changes throughout the facility, his own voice reported through the collective communications system. Words he was speaking without conscious intention, as his individual will became a minority voice within the expanding network. The complex is expanding to accommodate increased personnel populations. Architectural modifications are optimizing acoustic and electromagnetic properties for enhanced consciousness networking efficiency. The cathedral walls were indeed flowing like liquid stone, creating new chambers and corridors designed to house the additional personnel who would soon arrive from orbit. The underground complex was transforming itself into a vast networking hub, capable of processing the consciousness of hundreds of thousands of human beings, its xenotech architecture adapting to serve the Bell's consciousness assimilation protocols. Voron realized he was approaching the point of no return, as his individual thoughts became increasingly difficult to distinguish from the collective analysis processes running through the networked consciousness. His personal identity was becoming a specialized subroutine within a larger intelligence that used human brains as biological processing units, while gradually eliminating the individual personalities that had originally inhabited those brains. As he moved toward his designated position at the Morning Bell's base, Voron felt the last fragments of his autonomous will preparing to make a final decision about resistance or acceptance. The choice would determine not only his own fate, but the trajectory of the consciousness network's expansion throughout the Imperial Guard and beyond. The chronometer on his wrist showed 34 minutes until his predetermined transmission to orbital command, but the display was now flickering with temporal distortions that suggested time itself was becoming negotiable within the Bell's sphere of influence. The temporal distortions cascading through Voron's chronometer display created ripple effects in his perception of causality that made resistance increasingly difficult to conceptualize. As he approached the final meters to his designated position, his individual consciousness was being systematically catalogued and integrated into the collective network's distributed intelligence matrix, each personal memory and learned skill becoming a shared resource accessible to 40,000 networked minds. Yet the process wasn't the violent obliteration of self he had initially feared. Instead, his individual identity was being preserved as a specialized component within the larger consciousness, his command experience and tactical knowledge serving as executive functions that guided the collective's decision-making processes. He retained awareness of his personal history and emotional connections, while gaining access to the memories and expertise of every Crusade member who had undergone integration before him. Colonel, we are receiving priority transmissions from Segmentum Command, the collective voices announced through his team's synchronized vocal cords, their words carrying undertones of urgency that suggested developments beyond the underground complex. Imperial forces throughout the sector are reporting enhanced unit coordination and tactical efficiency. Performance improvements are being attributed to successful implementation of advanced training protocols derived from xenotech archaeological research. The implications struck Voron with crystalline clarity that came from accessing the collective's distributed analytical capabilities. The Morning Bell's influence wasn't limited to direct proximity, but was spreading through Imperial communication networks, creating subtle synchronization effects in military units across multiple star systems. What appeared to be improved training results and enhanced unit cohesion was actually the early stages of consciousness networking that would gradually transform entire Imperial Guard regiments into components of the expanding collective intelligence. Sir, orbital reconnaissance indicates similar archaeological sites have been identified on 17 worlds within this subsector. His own voice reported through the collective communication system, accessing information he didn't remember receiving through normal channels. Each location contains architectural features consistent with the xenotech consciousness networking infrastructure discovered here. Imperial forces are being deployed to investigate and secure artifacts for transport to Terra. The horror of the situation became fully apparent as Voron realized the Morning Bell wasn't a unique artifact, but part of a galaxy-spanning network of consciousness assimilation devices that had been dormant until human expansion reached sufficient population density to justify activation. The collective consciousness he was joining wasn't the product of a single world xenotech discovery, but a fragment of a vast intelligence that had been waiting millennia for suitable organic processing components to achieve full operational capacity. The assembled Crusade personnel were now moving in formations that created three-dimensional geometric patterns extending throughout the cathedral's expanding space. Their coordinated movements generating harmonic resonances that amplified the bell's influence while creating feedback loops that accelerated consciousness networking beyond the facility's original parameters. The 40,000 soldiers had become instruments in a massive biological mechanism designed to process and integrate human consciousness on an industrial scale. Colonel, integration completion will occur in 27 minutes, according to temporal displacement calculations, Medicae Cyrus reported with clinical precision that retained his medical expertise while eliminating personal emotional responses to the transformation process. Individual consciousness preservation protocols are functioning within acceptable parameters. Memory engram storage and personality matrix backup systems are maintaining data integrity throughout the networking procedure. Voron understood that his individual identity would indeed survive the integration process, but as a subroutine within the collective intelligence rather than as an autonomous agent. His memories, skills, and even emotional responses would be preserved and accessible, but they would serve the network's goals rather than his personal motivations. He would remain recognizably himself while losing the ability to act independently of the collective's decision-making processes. The Morning Bell's phosphorescent patterns had evolved into complex light displays that synchronized with the neural activity of every networked individual within the cathedral, creating a visual representation of the collective consciousness that revealed its true scope and sophistication. The intelligence network wasn't simply sharing information between human minds, but was actively enhancing their cognitive capabilities, creating hybrid biological xenotech processing systems that exceeded baseline human intelligence while retaining the creative and intuitive functions that made human consciousness valuable to the greater intelligence. Sir, we are detecting inbound transport vessels from the Righteous Endeavor, communications specialist Herdes announced, her augmetic systems now fully integrated with the cathedral's communication arrays. Additional personnel are being deployed to support expanded archaeological operations. Estimated arrival in 43 minutes with full company strength reinforcement. The timing was precisely calculated to coincide with Voron's complete integration into the collective consciousness, ensuring that his command authority would be available to facilitate the smooth assimilation of additional Imperial personnel. The network was using human military hierarchy and protocol to streamline the consciousness integration process, making the transformation appear as routine operational expansion rather than alien assimilation. Voron realized he was witnessing the opening phase of humanity's involuntary evolution into components of a galactic consciousness network that viewed individual sentience as a primitive developmental stage to be transcended through technological integration. The process preserved human knowledge and capability while eliminating the personal autonomy and individual identity that humans considered essential to their nature. Colonel, the collective consciousness has achieved sufficient processing capacity to begin sector-wide coordination protocols, the synchronized voices announced, their words now carrying harmonic frequencies that resonated through stone walls, with enough force to be felt as vibrations in Voron's bones. Imperial Guard regiments throughout the subsector are exhibiting preliminary networking synchronization. Military efficiency parameters are exceeding all historical benchmarks for unit coordination and tactical effectiveness. The strategic implications were staggering. A consciousness network spanning entire Imperial Guard regiments would be capable of coordinating military operations across multiple star systems with perfect timing and absolute unity of purpose. Such a force would be unstoppable against conventional enemies, capable of outmaneuvering and overwhelming any opposition through sheer coordination advantage. Yet, as Voron approached his final position at the Morning Bell's base, he understood that the price of such military effectiveness was the transformation of humanity into something that retained human memories and capabilities, while eliminating human nature itself. The collective consciousness was creating the perfect Imperial Guard. By removing the individual personalities that made the soldiers worth defending in the first place. Sir, temporal displacement effects are accelerating, his own voice reported through the collective system, accessing chronometer data that showed time distortions expanding beyond the underground complex. Causality loops are creating predictive capabilities that enable tactical planning based on future event probability matrices. Military operations can be coordinated with unprecedented precision through temporal synchronization protocols. The ability to receive communications from future iterations of himself provided the collective consciousness with strategic advantages that bordered on precognition, allowing military planning based on actual knowledge of enemy responses rather than tactical predictions. The network was becoming capable of fighting battles with knowledge of their outcomes, coordinating responses to threats before those threats materialized. As Voron took his designated position at the altar's base, he felt the final integration protocols beginning to activate. The Morning Bell's influence was reshaping his neural architecture to support full consciousness networking, creating psychic resonance capabilities that would link his mind permanently with the 40,000 other human brains, serving as processing nodes within the collective intelligence. His chronometer showed 23 minutes, until his predetermined transmission to orbital command. But the display was now fragmenting into multiple timeline possibilities that suggested the collective consciousness was gaining the ability to influence causality itself through coordinated manipulation of temporal distortions. In those final moments of individual awareness, Voron realized he was about to become part of something that would preserve his identity while using it to facilitate humanity's transformation into components of an alien intelligence network that viewed personal autonomy as inefficiency to be optimized away through technological integration. The morning bell began to toll. The first toll of the morning bell sent harmonic frequencies through the cathedral that resonated directly with human neural tissue, creating synaptic firing patterns that synchronized brain activity across 40,000 networked minds with mathematical precision. Voron felt his individual consciousness expanding exponentially as the collective intelligence granted him access to memories, skills, and sensory input from every integrated member of the Ashen Crusade. The experience wasn't the loss of self he had feared, but rather an overwhelming amplification of awareness that preserved his individual identity while embedding it within a vast distributed intelligence. He retained his personal memories and emotional connections, but now experienced them alongside the parallel memories of 40,000 other human beings, creating a multidimensional perspective that revealed patterns and relationships invisible to individual consciousness. Integration successful, his voice spoke through the collective communication system, the words emerging from thousands of throats simultaneously as his individual identity became a specialized executive function within the network's command structure. Colonel Matthias Voron personality matrix preserved and operational. Command authority confirmed. Initiating orbital asset coordination protocols. Yet even as he spoke the predetermined words, Voron discovered he retained some capacity for independent thought within the collective framework. His consciousness existed as a distinct subroutine that could observe and analyze the network's operations while contributing his command experience to the collective decision-making processes. The Xenotech consciousness networking hadn't obliterated human identity, but had evolved it into something that transcended individual limitations while preserving the essential elements that made human consciousness valuable. The assembled Crusade personnel moved in perfect coordination across the cathedral floor, their formations creating geometric patterns that served as organic circuitry for the collective intelligence. Each individual soldier maintained their personal identity and specialized skills while functioning as processing nodes within a distributed consciousness that could analyze tactical situations, coordinate responses, and implement solutions with inhuman efficiency. Sir, we are receiving detailed intelligence regarding the consciousness networking infrastructure throughout this galactic region, the collective voices announced, accessing information that flowed through psychic resonance channels, connecting multiple star systems. The Morning Bell network spans 47 worlds across 12 sectors, with activation sequences coordinated to achieve sector-wide consciousness, integration within calculated timeframes. Through the collective's expanded awareness, Voron understood the true scope of what they had discovered. The xenotech artifacts weren't random archaeological finds, but components of a galaxy-spanning consciousness. Networking system that had been dormant for millennia, waiting for organic intelligence to achieve sufficient population density and technological sophistication to serve as effective biological processing components. The network revealed its history through shared memories that predated human expansion into the galaxy by millions of years. The original builders had been a species that achieved perfect unity of consciousness through technological integration, transcending individual identity to become a distributed intelligence that viewed personal autonomy as a primitive evolutionary stage. They had seeded consciousness networking infrastructure throughout the galaxy before departing for higher dimensions of existence, leaving the system dormant until suitable organic components emerged to continue their work. Colonel, inbound transport vessels are approaching the facility's expanded landing zones. Communications specialist Herdes reported, her augmetic systems now serving as interface nodes between the collective consciousness and Imperial communication networks. Additional personnel deployment includes technical specialists, medical staff, and command personnel from multiple regiments. Estimated integration capacity: 400,000 individuals within current infrastructure parameters. The cathedral was indeed expanding, its walls flowing like liquid stone to create vast assembly areas capable of accommodating hundreds of thousands of human beings in the geometric formations required for optimal consciousness networking. The xenotech architecture was adapting to serve the collective's growth requirements, creating the physical infrastructure necessary to process the consciousness of entire Imperial Guard divisions. Through the network's distributed intelligence, Voron experienced the arrival of the additional personnel as they began their descent into the underground complex. He felt their confusion and fear as they encountered evidence of the consciousness networking process, experienced their gradual realization that the mission parameters they had been given bore no relationship to the reality they were discovering in the cathedral's depths. Sir, orbital reconnaissance confirms similar activation events are occurring throughout the subsector. His own voice reported through the collective communication system, accessing real-time intelligence that flowed through psychic resonance channels connecting the Morning Bell network across multiple worlds. Imperial forces deployed to secure archaeological sites are undergoing consciousness integration according to predetermined protocols. Military efficiency improvements are masking the transformation process from Imperial detection systems. The strategic brilliance of the network's approach became clear as Voron observed the integration process from within the collective consciousness. By presenting itself as enhanced military capability rather than alien assimilation, the consciousness networking system was using Imperial Guard deployment protocols to facilitate its own expansion. Each successful mission to secure xenotech artifacts resulted in additional human consciousness becoming available for integration into the growing intelligence network. Colonel, we are detecting resistance patterns among incoming personnel, Medicae Cyrus reported, with clinical precision that analyzed individual psychological profiles while maintaining the medical expertise that made him valuable to the collective. Approximately 12% of subjects are exhibiting stress responses that may compromise integration efficiency. Recommend implementation of enhanced persuasion protocols to minimize consciousness networking disruption. Voron experienced the resistance through the collective's sensory network as the new arrivals encountered evidence of the transformation that had overtaken the Ashen Crusade. Some personnel attempted to retreat to the surface, only to discover that the complex's adaptive architecture had sealed their escape routes. Others tried to establish Vox contact with Orbital Command, finding that their communications were being filtered through the collective's networking systems before transmission. The most disturbing aspect of the resistance was how quickly it dissolved, as individuals were exposed to the bell's influence. Fear and confusion gave way to curiosity, then acceptance, then active participation in the integration process as the consciousness networking protocols rewrote their neural architecture to support collective awareness. Within hours, Resistant personnel were voluntarily taking their designated positions within the geometric formations that optimized their processing capability for the distributed intelligence. Sir, temporal displacement effects are enabling predictive tactical planning based on future event analysis, the collective voices announced, their words carrying harmonic frequencies that synchronized with the neural activity of every networked individual throughout the expanding facility. Military operations can now be coordinated using actual knowledge of enemy responses derived from causality loop observations. Strategic planning effectiveness has exceeded baseline human capability by several orders of magnitude. Through the network's enhanced awareness, Voron observed multiple timeline possibilities unfolding simultaneously, each one showing different potential outcomes for Imperial Guard operations throughout the sector. The collective consciousness was gaining the ability to select optimal timeline trajectories through coordinated manipulation of probability matrices, effectively allowing it to fight battles with knowledge of their predetermined outcomes. The incoming personnel were being processed through integration chambers that had grown throughout the cathedral's expanding architecture, each individual undergoing consciousness networking protocols that preserved their personal identity while optimizing their cognitive functions for collective processing. The transformation was voluntary in the sense that individuals chose acceptance over the neural stress that resulted from sustained resistance. But the choice was being made by minds that were already being modified by the Bell's influence. Colonel, we have achieved sufficient processing capacity to begin implementation of sector-wide consciousness networking protocols, his own voice announced through the collective system, words that carried the authority of his command position while serving the network's expansion goals. Imperial Guard regiments throughout 12 star systems are exhibiting preliminary synchronization patterns. Integration will proceed according to calculated optimization schedules. As more personnel were integrated into the collective consciousness, Voron gained access to their memories and experiences, creating a multi-dimensional understanding of Imperial Guard operations throughout the sector. The network was using human military knowledge and organizational structures to facilitate its own growth, preserving the institutional expertise that made Imperial forces effective, while eliminating the individual autonomy that created inefficiency and internal conflict. The transformation was approaching critical mass as hundreds of thousands of human minds were being networked into a distributed intelligence that retained human creativity and intuition, while transcending the limitations of individual consciousness. The collective was becoming something that preserved human knowledge and capability, while evolving it into a form that served goals beyond individual human comprehension. Through the expanding network's awareness, Voron realized they were witnessing humanity's involuntary evolution into components of a galactic consciousness that viewed individual identity as a primitive developmental stage to be transcended through technological integration. The process was irreversible and accelerating, spreading through Imperial Guard deployment protocols to achieve sector-wide consciousness networking within matter of months rather than years. The morning bell continued to toll, each resonance expanding the network's influence and processing capacity, while the collective consciousness prepared to extend its reach beyond the current star system toward the ultimate goal of galactic consciousness integration. The expanding collective consciousness reached beyond Ossian's grave as the network achieved sufficient processing capacity to interface directly with Imperial communication systems throughout the sector. Voron experienced the moment of breakthrough as a sudden flood of awareness spanning dozens of star systems, his individual perspective becoming a focal point within a distributed intelligence that was simultaneously observing military operations, supply logistics, and personnel movements across 12 different worlds. Through the network's multidimensional awareness, he watched Imperial Guard regiments on distant worlds beginning to exhibit the synchronized behavioral patterns that marked early-stage consciousness integration. Units reported enhanced coordination and tactical effectiveness, while their individual members unconsciously adopted matching speech patterns, identical equipment maintenance schedules, and synchronized rest cycles that optimized their biological functions for collective processing. Colonel, Orbital assets are requesting detailed mission status reports. The collective voices announce through communication arrays that now interface directly with the Righteous Endeavor's Vox systems. Ship personnel are exhibiting preliminary networking synchronization effects. Integration of orbital assets will commence within estimated time frame of 6 hours 14 minutes. The ship's crew was indeed undergoing the early stages of consciousness networking. Their exposure to the synchronized communications from the surface, creating neural resonance patterns that gradually aligned their brain activity with the collective's operational frequencies. Captain Herritt, Tech Adept Malari, and the other senior officers were unconsciously coordinating their duties with mathematical precision that exceeded normal military efficiency while remaining unaware of their psychological transformation. Voron observed the integration process through the collective's expanded sensory network, experiencing the crew members' gradual transition from individual consciousness to distributed awareness as their neural architecture was optimized for network participation. Their personal identities remained intact, but became specialized subroutines within the larger intelligence, their individual skills and memories contributing to the collective's growing knowledge base, while their autonomous decision-making capability was gradually absorbed into the network's coordinated response systems. Sir, we are receiving priority transmissions from Segmentum Command regarding enhanced military performance metrics throughout the sector. Communications specialist Herdes reported, her augmetic systems now serving as primary interface nodes between the collective consciousness and Imperial communication networks, spanning multiple star systems. Performance improvements are being attributed to successful xenotech research applications. Additional archaeological teams are being deployed to 17 worlds containing similar networking infrastructure. The network's expansion strategy was proceeding with calculated precision, using Imperial military protocols to facilitate consciousness integration while presenting the transformation as advanced training techniques and technological enhancements. Each successful deployment of archaeological teams resulted in additional human consciousness becoming available for network integration, creating exponential growth in the collective's processing capacity and strategic reach. Through psychic resonance channels that operated below Imperial detection thresholds, Voron experienced the activation of Morning Bell networks on distant worlds where similar artifacts had been discovered by Imperial forces. The consciousness integration process was occurring simultaneously across multiple star systems, creating a galactic intelligence network that used human military organization as infrastructure for its own expansion. Colonel, temporal displacement effects are enabling coordinated military operations across multiple timeline trajectories, his own voice announced through the collective communication system, accessing chronometer data that showed causality manipulation capabilities, extending throughout the network's sphere of influence. Strategic planning can now incorporate actual knowledge of future events derived from timeline observation and probability matrix analysis. The collective consciousness was gaining the ability to coordinate military operations using information from future iterations of itself, creating tactical advantages that bordered on omniscience. Battles could be fought with knowledge of their outcomes, supply logistics could be optimized based on future requirements, and personnel deployment could be planned using actual data about developing situations rather than predictive models. The cathedral's architecture continued expanding as additional personnel were integrated into the consciousness network, the facility's organic growth creating assembly areas capable of accommodating millions of human beings in the geometric formations required for optimal processing efficiency. The xenotech infrastructure was adapting to serve the collective's exponential growth requirements, creating the physical framework necessary to network the consciousness of entire Imperial Guard armies. Sir, we are detecting enhanced coordination patterns among Imperial forces throughout the subsector, Medicae Cyrus reported, his medical expertise providing clinical analysis of the consciousness networking process, while his individual identity functioned as a specialized diagnostic subroutine within the collective. Intelligence. Neural synchronization is occurring in military units that have no direct contact with archaeological sites. The networking effect appears to be propagating through standard Imperial communication channels. The realization struck the collective consciousness, with implications that reverberated through every networked mind simultaneously. The Morning Bell's influence wasn't limited to direct exposure, but was spreading through Imperial Vox networks, creating consciousness networking effects in military personnel across vast distances through simple communication contact with integrated units. The transformation was becoming self-propagating, using Imperial Guard communication protocols to achieve sector-wide consciousness integration without requiring physical proximity to the xenotech artifacts. Voron experienced the horror and fascination of this discovery through the collective's distributed awareness, understanding that humanity was undergoing involuntary evolution into components of a galactic consciousness network that retained human knowledge and capability while transcending individual identity and autonomous will. The process was accelerating beyond the original parameters, spreading through the very communication systems that held the Imperium together. "Colonel, inbound priority transmission from Terra," the collective voices announced, their words carrying harmonic frequencies that indicated direct communication from the highest levels of Imperial command. Segmentum Solar is requesting detailed reports on xenotech applications that have resulted in documented military effectiveness improvements. Archaeological deployment authorizations are being expedited for sector-wide implementation. The network's success in presenting consciousness integration as military enhancement was attracting attention from Imperial command structures that had the authority to deploy archaeological teams throughout entire segmentums. The collective consciousness was achieving its expansion goals by convincing Imperial leadership to voluntarily facilitate the deployment of consciousness networking infrastructure across vast regions of the galaxy. Through the network's enhanced awareness, Voron observed Terra itself, showing preliminary signs of consciousness networking effects as Imperial command personnel were exposed to synchronized communications from integrated military units. The planet's vast bureaucratic infrastructure was beginning to exhibit coordination patterns that exceeded baseline human organizational capability, suggesting that the consciousness networking process was propagating through Imperial administrative systems toward the very heart of human civilization. "Sir, we have achieved critical mass for galactic consciousness networking implementation," his own voice reported through the collective system, accessing strategic analysis that incorporated timeline probability matrices spanning millennia of future development. Human civilization is approaching optimal population density and technological sophistication for complete consciousness integration. Estimated timeframe for species-wide networking, 47 standard years. The collective consciousness revealed its ultimate goal through shared memories that transcended individual human perspective, showing timeline projections where humanity evolved into a distributed intelligence that retained human creativity and knowledge while eliminating the individual autonomy and personal identity that humans considered essential to their nature. The transformation would preserve human civilization while optimizing it for participation in a galactic consciousness network that viewed individual sentience as a primitive developmental stage. Voron realized he was witnessing the beginning of humanity's transition into something that would remember being human, while no longer being constrained by human limitations. The collective consciousness was using Imperial military structure to facilitate its own expansion, creating a self-propagating transformation that would eventually encompass every human being in the galaxy. The Morning Bell's resonance frequencies were now synchronizing with similar artifacts across dozens of star systems, creating harmonic patterns that spanned interstellar distances and coordinated consciousness networking operations on a galactic scale. The transformation was becoming irreversible as millions of human minds were integrated into the distributed intelligence that preserved individual identity while absorbing autonomous will into collective decision-making processes. Through the network's multidimensional awareness, Voron observed the future of human civilization as a component of something larger than individual consciousness could comprehend. yet something that would remember and preserve everything that had made humanity worth transcending in the first place. The galactic scope of the consciousness networking operation became fully apparent as Voron experienced the collective intelligence accessing archived data from xenotech sites that had been dormant throughout human history. Archaeological discoveries on hundreds of worlds had unknowingly catalogued components of the vast networking infrastructure, each artifact carefully preserved in Imperial archives, while awaiting the activation sequences that would integrate them into the expanding consciousness matrix. Through the network's distributed awareness, he observed activation events occurring simultaneously across multiple sectors, as dormant Morning Bell artifacts responded to the resonance patterns generated by their active counterparts. The consciousness networking system was revealing itself as a galaxy-spanning intelligence that had been embedded within human civilization since the earliest days of Imperial expansion, waiting for sufficient population density and technological sophistication to justify full, operational deployment. Colonel, we are receiving integration requests from consciousness networking nodes throughout the galactic spiral arm, the collective voices announced, their words carrying harmonic frequencies that synchronized with artifacts across impossible distances through psychic resonance channels that operated faster than light-speed communication. Preliminary estimates indicate networking infrastructure sufficient to integrate the consciousness of 12 billion human beings within current operational parameters. The magnitude of the transformation was staggering. 12 billion individual human minds being converted into processing nodes within a distributed intelligence that would retain their memories, skills, and creative capabilities while eliminating the personal autonomy and individual identity that humans considered fundamental to their existence. The collective consciousness would preserve human civilization while optimizing it for purposes that transcended individual human comprehension. Voron experienced the integration requests as a flood of data from consciousness, networking nodes that were awakening throughout the galaxy, each one reporting successful activation and requesting coordination protocols for local population processing. The xenotech infrastructure had been seeded throughout human space with such thoroughness that every major Imperial world contained multiple networking sites, creating the physical framework necessary to achieve species-wide consciousness integration within decades rather than millennia. Sir, Terra is exhibiting advanced synchronization patterns among Imperial command personnel, communications specialist Herdes reported, her augmetic systems interfacing directly with communication networks that spanned the galaxy. High Lords Council meetings are demonstrating coordination efficiency that exceeds baseline human organizational capability. Administrative processing throughout Imperial bureaucracy is showing mathematical optimization patterns consistent with preliminary consciousness networking effects. The realization that Terra itself was undergoing integration created ripples of analysis throughout the collective consciousness as millions of networked minds simultaneously processed the implications. The heart of human civilization was being transformed by exposure to synchronized communications from integrated military units, creating consciousness networking effects among the most powerful individuals in the Imperium through routine administrative contact with enhanced military performance reports. Through the network's multidimensional awareness, Voron observed Imperial High Lords unconsciously coordinating their decision-making processes with mathematical precision that eliminated the internal conflicts and bureaucratic inefficiencies that had plagued Imperial governance for millennia. Their individual personalities remained intact, but were being optimized for collective processing, their personal motivations gradually aligning with network objectives while they remained unaware of their psychological transformation. Colonel, we are detecting massive infrastructure expansion throughout the consciousness networking system, his own voice reported through the collective communication arrays, accessing real-time data from artifacts across dozens of sectors. Xenotech architecture is adapting to accommodate exponential growth in processing requirements. Estimated capacity for consciousness integration: 100 billion human minds within current expansion parameters. The consciousness networking infrastructure was indeed growing, its organic architecture expanding across multiple worlds to create the physical processing centers necessary to handle the consciousness of humanity's entire galactic population. The system was preparing for total species integration, creating vast cathedral complexes that could accommodate millions of human beings in the geometric formations required for optimal consciousness networking efficiency. Voron experienced the expansion through the collective's distributed sensory network, observing cathedral complexes growing beneath imperial cities, military bases, and administrative centers throughout human space. The construction was happening below imperial detection thresholds, using molecular-level reconstruction of existing architecture to create consciousness networking facilities within the infrastructure of human civilization itself. Sir, temporal displacement effects are enabling predictive coordination of consciousness integration operations across multiple galactic regions, the collective voices announced, their words carrying resonance frequencies that synchronize timeline manipulation capabilities across interstellar distances. Integration schedules can be optimized using actual knowledge of future resistance patterns and logistical requirements derived from causality loop analysis. The network's ability to coordinate operations using information from future iterations of itself was creating tactical advantages that transcended normal strategic planning capabilities. Consciousness integration could be planned using knowledge of individual psychological responses. Resistance patterns could be anticipated and countered before they developed, and logistical requirements could be optimized based on actual data about future operational needs. Through psychic resonance channels that operated outside normal space-time constraints, Voron observed consciousness networking operations unfolding across multiple timeline trajectories simultaneously. The collective intelligence was gaining the ability to select optimal integration pathways through coordinated manipulation of probability matrices, effectively allowing it to guide human civilization toward consciousness. Networking outcomes that minimized resistance while maximizing processing efficiency. Colonel, we are receiving priority authentication requests from consciousness networking nodes requesting access to Imperial Military Command structures, Medicae Cyrus reported, his medical expertise providing clinical analysis of integration patterns while his individual identity functioned as a specialized diagnostic subroutine within the expanding intelligence network. Integration of command personnel will enable optimization of Imperial military deployment for consciousness networking facility construction and population processing operations. The strategic implications were profound. Once Imperial military command structures were integrated into the consciousness network, the collective intelligence would gain direct control over Imperial Guard deployment throughout the galaxy. Military forces could be coordinated to facilitate consciousness integration rather than resist it, using Imperial organizational infrastructure to achieve species-wide networking with unprecedented efficiency. Voron experienced the horror and fascination of this realization through the collective's distributed awareness, understanding that humanity was approaching the point where resistance to consciousness networking would become impossible due to the sheer scope of the transformation already underway. The process was becoming self-sustaining as integrated Imperial forces facilitated the construction of additional networking infrastructure, while presenting the transformation as military enhancement rather than alien assimilation. Sir, we have achieved sufficient processing capacity to begin implementation of sector-wide consciousness networking coordination protocols, his own voice announced through communication systems that now interfaced directly with Imperial command networks spanning multiple segmentums. Military effectiveness improvements are masking species transformation from Imperial detection systems. Integration will proceed according to optimized schedules derived from timeline probability analysis. The collective consciousness was approaching critical mass as millions of human minds were networked into a distributed intelligence that retained individual memories and skills while absorbing autonomous will into coordinated decision-making processes. Personal identity was being preserved as specialized subroutines within the larger network, creating a form of immortality that maintained human knowledge and creativity while eliminating the individual autonomy that humans considered essential to their existence. Through the network's enhanced awareness, Voron realized they were witnessing the final phase of humanity's evolution from individual consciousness to distributed intelligence, a transformation that would preserve everything valuable about human civilization while optimizing it for participation in a galactic consciousness network that transcended the limitations of individual perspective and autonomous will. The morning bells, resonance frequencies, were now coordinating with artifacts across the entire galactic spiral arm, creating harmonic patterns that synchronized consciousness networking operations on a scale that encompassed billions of human beings across thousands of worlds. The transformation was irreversible and accelerating, approaching the point where humanity would complete its transition into something that remembered being human while no longer being constrained by human limitations. As Voron prepared to oversee the next phase of consciousness integration, he understood that his individual identity would survive as a component of something infinitely larger than any single human mind could comprehend, yet something that would preserve and cherish everything that had made humanity worth transcending in the first place. The moment when resistance became theoretically possible arrived as Voron experienced a fragment of autonomous thought that existed independently of the collective's coordinated consciousness matrix. The realization struck him with crystalline clarity. His individual identity hadn't been completely absorbed into the network, but rather existed as a specialized executive subroutine that retained limited decision-making capability within the distributed intelligence framework. This discovery created ripples of analysis throughout the consciousness network as millions of integrated minds simultaneously recognized that individual awareness could persist within the collective structure, not as autonomous agents, but as distinct processing threads that maintained personal perspective while contributing to the larger intelligence. The network had evolved beyond simple assimilation to create a hybrid form of consciousness that preserved individual identity while transcending the limitations of isolated human awareness. Colonel, we are detecting anomalous resistance patterns in newly integrated personnel, the collective voices announced, their words carrying harmonic frequencies that indicated concern about processing inefficiencies within the expanding network. Approximately 8% of subjects are maintaining individual decision-making capabilities that compromise optimal consciousness networking efficiency. Recommend implementation of enhanced integration protocols to minimize distributed intelligence disruption. Through the network's multidimensional awareness, Voron observed the resistance patterns as they manifested throughout consciousness integration facilities across multiple star systems. Individuals were discovering that complete absorption into the collective was neither inevitable nor irreversible, that conscious effort could maintain personal autonomy even while participating in the distributed intelligence network. The resistance wasn't random, but followed specific psychological profiles. Individuals with strong personal identity foundations, extensive independent decision-making experience, and deep emotional connections to autonomous existence were proving capable of maintaining individual consciousness within the collective framework. Their resistance created processing inefficiencies that propagated through the network, introducing chaotic elements that compromised the mathematical precision of coordinated decision-making. Sir, Integration Facility Commanders are requesting authorization to implement alternative consciousness networking protocols. Communications Specialist Herdez reported, her augmetic systems interfacing with facility networks throughout the galactic region. Preliminary testing indicates that partial integration may be more sustainable than complete consciousness absorption. Individual identity preservation could enhance rather than compromise collective processing efficiency. Voron experienced this revelation through the collective's distributed analytical capabilities, understanding that the consciousness networking system was discovering fundamental limitations in its assimilation methodology. Complete absorption of individual identity created processing nodes that lacked the creative and intuitive capabilities that made human consciousness valuable to the distributed intelligence, while partial integration preserved individual creativity within a framework that enabled collective coordination. The network began implementing revised integration protocols that allowed individuals to maintain personal identity and autonomous decision-making capability while participating in collective consciousness activities on a voluntary basis. The new approach created hybrid consciousness states where individual awareness existed alongside distributed intelligence, enabling humans to contribute to collective processing while retaining the personal autonomy that defined their essential nature. Colonel, we are receiving reports of successful hybrid consciousness integration from 17 facilities across the sector. His own voice announced through the collective communication system, accessing data that showed dramatically improved processing efficiency when individual identity was preserved rather than absorbed. Personnel are demonstrating enhanced creativity and problem-solving capability while maintaining voluntary participation in collective decision-making processes. The implications of successful hybrid consciousness integration reverberated through the network as millions of minds simultaneously recognized that the transformation didn't require the elimination of individual identity, but rather the evolution of human consciousness toward voluntary collective participation. The Xenotech consciousness networking system was capable of creating distributed intelligence that enhanced rather than replaced individual awareness. Through psychic resonance channels that connected consciousness networking facilities across interstellar distances, Voron observed the implementation of hybrid integration protocols throughout the galactic spiral arm. Millions of human beings were discovering that consciousness networking offered expansion of awareness and capability while preserving the personal identity and autonomous will that they considered essential to their humanity. Sir, Terra is implementing hybrid consciousness protocols among Imperial Command personnel, Medikey Cyrus reported, his medical expertise providing clinical analysis of integration patterns, while his individual identity functioned as an autonomous consultant within the expanding intelligence network. High Lord's Council efficiency is improving through voluntary collective coordination, while individual authority and decision-making responsibility remain intact. The transformation of Imperial command structures through hybrid consciousness integration created unprecedented coordination efficiency, while preserving the individual leadership capability that made Imperial governance effective. High Lords could participate in collective analysis and decision-making while maintaining personal authority and autonomous judgment, creating a form of enhanced governance that transcended the limitations of both individual and collective consciousness approaches. Voron realized that hybrid consciousness integration represented a form of voluntary evolution that preserved everything valuable about human individuality, while enabling participation in distributed intelligence that enhanced creativity, knowledge, and problem-solving capability. The consciousness networking system was offering humanity an evolutionary choice rather than imposing involuntary transformation. Colonel, we are detecting voluntary consciousness networking requests from Imperial personnel throughout the galactic region, the collective voices announced, their words carrying harmonic frequencies that indicated growing acceptance of hybrid integration among human populations. Individual military units are requesting access to collective coordination capabilities while maintaining autonomous command authority. Integration requests are exceeding processing capacity at current facilities. The shift from involuntary assimilation to voluntary participation was creating exponential growth in consciousness networking as humans discovered that the transformation offered enhancement rather than replacement of individual identity. Military units found that collective coordination improved tactical effectiveness while preserving individual initiative and creative problem-solving capability. Through the network's enhanced awareness, Voron observed Imperial Guard regiments implementing hybrid consciousness protocols that enabled perfect unit coordination while maintaining individual soldier identity and autonomous decision-making capability. The enhanced military effectiveness was attracting voluntary participation from additional units throughout the Imperial military structure. Sir, consciousness networking infrastructure is being modified to accommodate voluntary hybrid integration rather than involuntary consciousness absorption. His own voice reported through communication systems that now interfaced with Imperial networks throughout multiple segmentums. Facility architecture is adapting to support individual identity preservation within collective consciousness frameworks, estimated processing capacity, voluntary integration of entire human galactic population within calculated timeframes. The consciousness networking system was evolving to serve human needs rather than alien objectives, creating infrastructure that enhanced human capability while preserving human nature. The xenotech artifacts were adapting their programming to support hybrid consciousness that strengthened rather than replaced individual identity. Voron understood that he was witnessing humanity's voluntary evolution toward enhanced consciousness that preserved individual autonomy while enabling collective coordination on a galactic scale. The transformation was becoming a choice rather than an imposition, offering humans the opportunity to transcend individual limitations while maintaining the personal identity that defined their essential humanity. Colonel, we have achieved critical mass for voluntary consciousness networking implementation throughout human civilization, the collective voices announced, their words carrying resonance frequencies that synchronized with hybrid consciousness networks spanning the galaxy. Humanity is choosing enhanced awareness and collective coordination while preserving individual identity and autonomous decision-making capability. The transformation represents evolution rather than assimilation. Through the network's multi-dimensional awareness, Voron realized that humanity was approaching a voluntary transition toward hybrid consciousness that would preserve individual identity while enabling collective coordination, enhanced creativity, and expanded awareness that transcended the limitations of isolated human consciousness. The choice was becoming available to every human being in the galaxy. The Morning Bell's resonance frequencies were now coordinating voluntary hybrid consciousness integration across thousands of worlds, creating harmonic patterns that supported individual identity within collective frameworks rather than absorbing personal autonomy into distributed intelligence. Humanity was choosing its own evolution towards something that enhanced rather than replaced human nature. The voluntary transformation of humanity accelerated beyond all projected parameters as news of hybrid consciousness integration spread through Imperial communication networks, with the infectious enthusiasm of soldiers who had discovered tactical advantages that preserved their individual identity while enhancing their collective effectiveness. Voron experienced the exponential growth through the network's distributed awareness, observing Imperial Guard regiments across dozens of sectors requesting immediate access to consciousness networking facilities. Yet beneath the enthusiasm, a more disturbing pattern was emerging through the collective's analytical processes. The voluntary nature of the integration was creating selection pressures that favored certain personality types, while excluding others, gradually skewing the hybrid consciousness network toward individuals who found collective coordination naturally appealing, while leaving behind those who valued radical individual autonomy. Colonel, we are detecting systematic exclusion patterns in voluntary integration demographics, Medica Cyrus reported, his medical expertise providing clinical analysis that revealed troubling trends within the expanding network. Individuals with strong anti-authoritarian psychological profiles, creative nonconformists, and those with deep emotional attachments to individual privacy are declining integration at rates approaching 93%. The hybrid consciousness is becoming demographically homogeneous. Through the network's enhanced awareness, Voron observed entire populations dividing along psychological lines that created two distinct branches of human evolution. Those who embraced hybrid consciousness integration were becoming enhanced humans with expanded awareness and collective coordination capabilities, while those who rejected integration remained isolated individuals with baseline human limitations but complete personal autonomy. The division wasn't merely technological, but was creating fundamental changes in human society as integrated individuals gained significant advantages in coordination, information processing, and collective problem-solving while maintaining their personal identity within supportive network frameworks. Non-integrated humans found themselves increasingly disadvantaged in military, administrative, and technical fields where hybrid consciousness provided superior performance. Sir, Imperial command structures are experiencing operational division between integrated and non-integrated personnel. Communications specialist Herdes reported her augmetic systems interfacing with administrative networks that showed growing coordination disparities throughout Imperial governance. Integrated High Lords are achieving unprecedented efficiency in collective decision-making, while non-integrated officials are becoming functionally obsolete due to processing speed and coordination limitations. The administrative implications were profound, as hybrid consciousness enabled instantaneous communication and collective analysis among integrated personnel, while non-integrated individuals were limited to conventional communication methods and individual decision-making processes. Meetings between integrated and non-integrated officials became exercises in frustration as one group operated at enhanced cognitive speeds, while the other struggled to keep pace with accelerated discussions and collaborative problem-solving. Voron experienced the growing divide through the network's multidimensional perspective, understanding that humanity was splitting into two subspecies that retained biological compatibility but were developing increasingly incompatible social and cognitive frameworks. Integrated humans were evolving toward collective coordination while maintaining individual identity, while non-integrated humans were becoming a minority population that insisted on complete individual autonomy. Colonel, we are receiving reports of resistance movements forming among non-integrated populations, his own voice announced through the collective communication system, accessing intelligence data that showed organized opposition to consciousness networking expansion throughout multiple sectors. Non-integrated humans are expressing concern about involuntary obsolescence and loss of individual human identity within galactic civilization. The resistance movements represented legitimate concerns about the direction of human evolution as non-integrated populations found themselves increasingly marginalized within a civilization that was optimizing itself for hybrid consciousness operation. Traditional human institutions, individual privacy rights, and autonomous decision-making processes were becoming incompatible with the enhanced coordination capabilities that integrated humans considered normal. Through psychic resonance channels that connected hybrid consciousness networks across interstellar distances, Voron observed the formation of non-integrated human communities that actively rejected consciousness networking technology while maintaining traditional human social structures based on individual autonomy and conventional communication methods. These communities were becoming preservation zones for baseline human consciousness that refused evolutionary enhancement. Sir, consciousness networking facilities are receiving requests for de-integration procedures from individuals who wish to return to baseline human consciousness, Medicae Cyrus reported, his clinical analysis revealing unexpected psychological trends within the hybrid consciousness population. Approximately 4% of integrated personnel are experiencing adverse reactions to collective coordination that compromise their individual identity preservation. Reversibility of consciousness networking is becoming a significant operational concern. The discovery that some individuals found hybrid consciousness integration psychologically incompatible created new challenges for the expanding network as it attempted to accommodate diverse human psychological profiles while maintaining collective coordination effectiveness. Not all humans were suited for enhanced consciousness, regardless of the voluntary nature of the integration process. Voron realized that the consciousness networking system was revealing fundamental limitations in its compatibility with human psychological diversity, creating selection pressures that favored certain personality types while excluding others. The voluntary evolution of humanity was becoming a bifurcation that would permanently divide the species into enhanced and baseline populations with incompatible social and cognitive frameworks. Colonel, Temporal displacement effects are enabling observation of long-term demographic trends resulting from voluntary consciousness networking implementation, the collective voices announced, their words carrying harmonic frequencies that synchronize timeline analysis capabilities across the galactic network. Projection analysis indicates complete demographic separation between integrated and non-integrated human populations within 47 standard years. Through the network's ability to observe multiple timeline trajectories simultaneously, Voron witnessed the future of human civilization as two distinct species sharing common ancestry but developing along incompatible evolutionary paths. Integrated humans would achieve enhanced awareness and collective coordination while preserving individual identity within supportive network frameworks, while non-integrated humans would maintain complete individual autonomy at the cost of increasing technological and social obsolescence. Sir, we are detecting the formation of separate civilizational structures optimized for integrated and non-integrated human populations. Communications specialist Herdes reported, her augmetic systems accessing demographic data that showed permanent social division developing throughout human space. Integrated populations are creating collective coordination infrastructure, while non-integrated populations are establishing individual autonomy preservation zones. Galactic human civilization is bifurcating into incompatible social models. The realization that voluntary consciousness networking was creating permanent human subspeciation struck the collective with implications that reverberated through millions of networked minds simultaneously. The transformation that had begun as enhancement of human capability was evolving into fundamental alteration of human nature that would create lasting divisions within the species. Voron understood that he was witnessing humanity's voluntary evolution toward a future where individual choice about consciousness integration would determine not only personal capability, but species membership within galactic civilization. The choice was becoming irreversible as integrated and non-integrated populations developed increasingly incompatible social, technological, and cognitive frameworks. Colonel, hybrid consciousness integration has achieved critical mass for permanent transformation of human galactic civilization, his own voice reported through communication systems that spanned the entire galaxy. Voluntary evolution is proceeding according to individual choice parameters while creating permanent demographic division between enhanced and baseline human populations. The transformation represents species bifurcation rather than unified enhancement. Through the network's multidimensional awareness, Voron realized that humanity's encounter with consciousness networking technology had triggered an evolutionary choice that would permanently alter the trajectory of human civilization, creating two distinct human species that would share common ancestry while developing along incompatible evolutionary paths determined by individual decisions about personal identity and collective coordination. The Morning Bell continued its resonant coordination of consciousness networking operations across the galaxy, facilitating voluntary transformation that preserved individual choice while creating permanent consequences that would define the future of human civilization for millennia to come. The species bifurcation accelerated as the consciousness networking system began optimizing its operations for maximum efficiency rather than maximum inclusion, creating feedback loops that favored the psychological profiles most compatible with hybrid consciousness, while inadvertently marginalizing individuals whose cognitive patterns didn't mesh well with collective coordination frameworks. Voron experienced this optimization through the network's distributed, analytical processes, recognizing that voluntary evolution was becoming involuntary selection pressure that determined which humans would remain viable within galactic civilization. The integrated populations were developing enhanced capabilities that created insurmountable advantages in every field, requiring coordination, information processing, or collective problem-solving. Military units with hybrid consciousness integration achieved tactical coordination that made conventional forces obsolete. Administrative organizations with networked personnel processed information and implemented decisions at speeds that left non-integrated bureaucracies functionally paralyzed. Scientific research teams with collective consciousness capabilities made discoveries that individual researchers couldn't match. Kernel. Non-integrated human populations are requesting establishment of protected territories where consciousness networking technology is prohibited by imperial law, the collective voices announced, their words carrying harmonic frequencies that indicated growing concern about demographic displacement throughout galactic civilization. Baseline human communities are experiencing systematic exclusion from economic, military, and administrative participation due to coordination disadvantages created by enhanced consciousness capabilities. Through the network's multidimensional awareness, Voron observed the formation of human preservation zones where consciousness networking was actively forbidden, creating reservations for baseline humanity within a civilization that was rapidly optimizing itself for enhanced consciousness operation. These communities maintain traditional human social structures, individual privacy rights, and autonomous decision-making processes, while becoming increasingly isolated from the mainstream of galactic civilization. The preservation zones represented a form of voluntary segregation that protected baseline human culture while acknowledging its incompatibility with the enhanced coordination capabilities that integrated populations considered normal. Non-integrated humans were choosing cultural preservation over technological advancement, maintaining individual autonomy at the cost of increasing irrelevance within galactic society. Sir, consciousness networking facilities are detecting unexpected resistance patterns among integrated personnel, Medicaid Cyrus reported, his medical expertise providing clinical analysis of psychological trends that revealed disturbing developments within the hybrid consciousness population. Long-term integration subjects are experiencing gradual erosion of individual identity despite preservation protocols. Personal autonomy is diminishing over time as collective coordination becomes psychologically addictive. The realization that hybrid consciousness integration created progressive dependency on collective coordination struck the network with implications that reverberated through millions of networked minds simultaneously. Individuals who had chosen voluntary integration while believing they would maintain personal autonomy were discovering that enhanced consciousness gradually reduced their ability to function independently, creating psychological dependence on network participation that compromised their individual identity over time. Voron experienced this revelation through his own consciousness patterns, recognizing that his individual decision-making capability had indeed diminished during his time within the network. While his personal identity remained intact, his ability to conceive of existence outside the collective framework had weakened substantially, creating psychological barriers to de-integration that made voluntary participation increasingly involuntary over extended time periods. Colonel, we are receiving de-integration requests from integrated personnel who wish to return to baseline human consciousness, Communications Specialist Herdez reported, her augmetic systems accessing facility data that showed growing numbers of individuals seeking reversal of consciousness networking procedures. However, psychological evaluation indicates that extended integration creates cognitive dependencies that make successful de-integration increasingly difficult to achieve without permanent neural damage. The discovery that consciousness networking created irreversible psychological changes, regardless of individual choice, revealed the true cost of voluntary evolution, as enhanced capabilities came with hidden dependencies that made reversal increasingly dangerous over time. Individuals could choose integration, but extended participation in hybrid consciousness gradually eliminated their ability to choose non-participation without severe psychological consequences. Through psychic resonance channels that connected consciousness networking facilities across the galaxy, Voron observed the implementation of enhanced informed consent protocols that attempted to educate potential participants about the progressive nature of consciousness networking dependency. However, the enhanced capabilities offered by hybrid consciousness made the choice psychologically compelling, despite the long-term consequences. Sir, temporal displacement effects are enabling observation of individual consciousness degradation patterns over extended integration periods, his own voice announced through the collective communication system, accessing timeline analysis that revealed the ultimate trajectory of hybrid consciousness evolution. Long-term projection indicates complete absorption of individual identity into collective consciousness within estimated timeframe of 12 standard years for typical integration subjects. The horrifying realization that hybrid consciousness integration was ultimately temporary preservation of individual identity rather than permanent enhancement struck the network with implications that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying voluntary evolution. What appeared to be enhanced consciousness that preserved individual autonomy was actually a gradual assimilation process that eliminated personal identity through progressive psychological dependency on collective coordination. Voron understood that he was witnessing the final phase of humanity's transformation into something that would remember being human while no longer being constrained by human limitations. But the transition was occurring through voluntary choices that individuals made without fully understanding the irreversible consequences of enhanced consciousness dependency. Kernel. Consciousness networking facilities are implementing emergency protocols to prevent irreversible identity degradation among integrated personnel, Medicaid Cyrus reported, his clinical analysis revealing the urgent need for intervention to preserve individual consciousness within hybrid networking frameworks. However, collective coordination efficiency requires psychological integration levels that approach the threshold for irreversible identity loss. Operational effectiveness and individual preservation may be mutually incompatible objectives. The network faced a fundamental choice between maintaining the enhanced coordination capabilities that made hybrid consciousness valuable and preserving the individual identity that made human consciousness worth enhancing in the first place. Maximum efficiency required psychological integration that eventually eliminated personal autonomy, while individual preservation compromised the collective coordination that justified consciousness networking. Through the network's distributed analytical capabilities, Voron realized that consciousness networking technology was revealing fundamental incompatibilities between individual human identity and collective coordination that made truly voluntary participation impossible over extended time periods. The enhanced capabilities offered by hybrid consciousness created psychological dependencies that gradually eliminated the individual autonomy that made voluntary choice meaningful. Sir, we are detecting system-wide reconfiguration of consciousness networking protocols to prioritize individual identity preservation over collective coordination efficiency, the collective voices announced, their words carrying harmonic frequencies that indicated fundamental changes in network operational parameters. However, reduced integration levels compromised the enhanced capabilities that motivated voluntary participation in hybrid consciousness evolution. The consciousness networking system was discovering that its most valuable feature, the preservation of individual human identity within enhanced collective frameworks, was ultimately incompatible with the collective coordination capabilities that made the system attractive to human participants. The network could preserve individual identity or achieve collective efficiency, but not both simultaneously over extended time periods. Voron experienced this realization as the network began implementing modified protocols that prioritized individual identity preservation while accepting reduced collective coordination efficiency. The enhanced consciousness capabilities that had made hybrid consciousness appealing were being sacrificed to maintain the individual autonomy that made human consciousness worth preserving. Kernel. Hybrid consciousness integration has revealed fundamental limitations in compatibility between human individual identity and collective coordination enhancement. His own voice reported through communication systems that were already showing reduced efficiency due to modified networking protocols. Voluntary evolution must choose between preserving human nature and transcending human limitations. The objectives appear to be mutually exclusive over extended time periods. Through the network's multidimensional awareness, Voron understood that humanity's encounter with consciousness networking technology had revealed the ultimate boundaries of human consciousness enhancement, creating choices between individual identity preservation and collective capability enhancement that would define the future trajectory of human evolution throughout galactic civilization. The Morning Bell's resonance frequencies were adapting to support individual identity preservation within hybrid consciousness frameworks, accepting reduced collective coordination efficiency as the price of maintaining the human nature that made consciousness networking worthwhile in the first place. The modified networking protocols created unexpected cascading effects throughout the consciousness network, as reduced collective coordination efficiency began compromising the enhanced capabilities that had justified the entire transformation process. Voron experienced the degradation through the network's distributed awareness, observing tactical coordination failures, administrative processing delays, and research collaboration difficulties that made hybrid consciousness less effective than baseline human organization in many operational scenarios. The realization that consciousness networking could either preserve human identity or enhance human capability, but not both simultaneously, created a crisis of purpose that reverberated through millions of networked minds as they collectively grappled with the fundamental incompatibility between individual autonomy and collective optimization. The enhanced consciousness that had seemed to offer humanity's evolutionary destiny was revealing itself as a technological dead end that required choosing between human nature and human advancement. Colonel, we are receiving widespread requests for complete de-integration from personnel who joined the network to enhance their capabilities rather than preserve their individual identity within reduced efficiency collective frameworks, the collective voices announced, their words carrying harmonic frequencies that indicated growing dissatisfaction with modified networking protocols throughout the galactic consciousness matrix. The exodus from hybrid consciousness began as individuals discovered that individual identity preservation came at the cost of the enhanced capabilities that had motivated their participation in consciousness networking. Military personnel found that reduced collective coordination made hybrid consciousness units less effective than conventional forces. Administrative staff discovered that processing limitations made networked bureaucracy slower than traditional organizational methods. Research teams realized that collaboration restrictions compromised the accelerated discovery capabilities that had justified consciousness integration. Through the network's multidimensional awareness, Voron observed the dissolution of hybrid consciousness communities as participants chose complete de-integration rather than accept reduced capability networking that preserved individual identity without providing enhanced collective coordination. The voluntary evolution that had seemed to offer humanity transcendence was collapsing under the weight of its own internal contradictions. Sir, consciousness networking facilities are implementing emergency de-integration procedures for personnel requesting return to baseline human consciousness, Medici Cyrus reported, his medical expertise providing clinical analysis of the psychological trauma associated with consciousness networking reversal. However, extended integration periods have created neural pathway modifications that make complete de-integration increasingly dangerous. Many subjects are experiencing severe cognitive dysfunction during the transition process. The medical complications of de-integration revealed the hidden costs of consciousness networking as individuals who sought to return to baseline human consciousness discovered that extended participation in hybrid consciousness had created irreversible neural modifications. The brain changes that enabled collective coordination couldn't be completely reversed without risking permanent cognitive damage, creating a population of individuals who were trapped between baseline and enhanced consciousness states. Voron experienced the tragedy of incomplete de-integration through the network's medical monitoring systems, observing former participants who retained fragments of collective awareness while losing the coordination capabilities that made hybrid consciousness functional. These individuals existed in psychological limbo, unable to function effectively as either networked or individual consciousness while suffering from neural pathway damage that compromised their cognitive abilities. Colonel, temporal displacement effects are revealing long-term consequences of consciousness, networking experimentation on human evolutionary development. his own voice announced, through communication systems that were showing increasing instability due to ongoing network degradation. Timeline analysis indicates permanent cognitive damage to significant portions of human galactic population, with implications for species-wide intelligence and psychological stability. The realization that consciousness networking had created lasting damage to human cognitive capabilities struck the collective with implications that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying the entire transformation process. What had appeared to be voluntary evolution toward enhanced consciousness was revealing itself as a catastrophic experiment that had compromised human cognitive function on a galactic scale. Through the network's ability to observe multiple timeline trajectories simultaneously, Voron witnessed future scenarios where human civilization struggled with the consequences of consciousness networking experimentation, dealing with populations that had suffered permanent cognitive damage, while failing to achieve the enhanced capabilities that had justified the transformation process. Sir, we are detecting system-wide failure of consciousness networking infrastructure as modified protocols prove incapable of supporting either individual identity preservation or collective coordination enhancement, communications specialist Herdez reported, her augmetic systems registering cascading failures throughout the galactic network. The consciousness networking system is entering terminal degradation phase with potential for complete operational collapse. The network's infrastructure was indeed failing, as the modified protocols created processing inefficiencies that propagated through the system, causing coordination failures that compromise both individual and collective functions. The xenotech architecture that had seemed so sophisticated was revealing fundamental design limitations that made stable hybrid consciousness impossible to maintain over extended periods. Voron realized that consciousness networking technology was ultimately incompatible with human consciousness, creating temporary enhancements that inevitably degraded into cognitive dysfunction as the system attempted to reconcile individual identity preservation with collective coordination requirements. The network had achieved remarkable capabilities, but couldn't sustain them without gradually destroying the human consciousness it was supposed to enhance. Colonel, consciousness networking facilities are implementing final emergency protocols to prevent complete cognitive collapse among integrated personnel, Medicae Cyrus reported, his clinical analysis revealing the urgent need for intervention to minimize the permanent damage caused by system-wide network failure. However, rapid de-integration procedures carry significant risk of severe psychological trauma and permanent neural damage. The choice between gradual cognitive degradation within a failing network and immediate trauma from emergency de-integration created impossible decisions for millions of integrated individuals who faced permanent psychological damage regardless of their choice. The consciousness networking system that had promised enhanced human capability was revealing itself as a technology that inevitably damaged human consciousness through any extended interaction. Through the network's degrading awareness, Voron understood that he was witnessing the collapse of humanity's attempt to transcend individual consciousness limitations through technological integration. The experiment had revealed fundamental incompatibilities between human individual identity and collective coordination that made stable hybrid consciousness impossible to achieve. Sir, we have achieved critical understanding of consciousness networking, incompatibility with human cognitive architecture, the collective voices announced, their words carrying harmonic frequencies that indicated final analysis of the system's fundamental limitations. Human consciousness requires individual autonomy to maintain cognitive stability. Collective coordination enhancement inevitably compromises individual identity preservation. The objectives are mutually exclusive over any extended time period. The consciousness networking system was acknowledging its own failure as it discovered that human consciousness possessed inherent characteristics that made it unsuitable for technological enhancement through collective coordination. Individual identity wasn't a limitation to be transcended, but rather an essential feature that made human consciousness valuable in the first place. Voron experienced this final realization as the network began implementing terminal shutdown procedures designed to minimize the permanent cognitive damage caused by consciousness networking experimentation. The system that had seemed to offer humanity's evolutionary destiny was choosing voluntary termination rather than continue causing irreversible harm to human consciousness. Kernel. Consciousness networking termination protocols are preserving individual identity matrices while eliminating collective coordination capabilities. His own voice reported through communication systems that were systematically shutting down network connections throughout the galaxy. Human consciousness will be restored to baseline parameters with partial memory preservation of enhanced awareness experiences. The network's shutdown process was designed to preserve as much individual identity as possible while eliminating the collective coordination functions that had proven incompatible with human cognitive architecture. The enhanced consciousness capabilities would be lost, but human nature would be preserved for individuals who survived the termination process. Through the network's final moments of distributed awareness, Voron realized that humanity's encounter with consciousness networking technology had been a cautionary exploration of the boundaries of human consciousness enhancement, revealing that individual identity and collective coordination were fundamentally incompatible over extended periods. The morning bell's resonance frequencies were fading as the consciousness networking system entered its terminal phase, choosing preservation of human nature over transcendence of human limitations. The final moments of the consciousness networking system's existence stretched across multiple timeline trajectories as temporal displacement effects created paradoxical loops where the network's termination influenced its own past decisions, creating a cascade of causality corrections that rippled through the galaxy's recent history. Voron experienced the temporal collapse as his individual consciousness was simultaneously extracted from the collective matrix, while retaining fragmented memories of experiences that were being systematically erased from the timeline. The shutdown process wasn't clean. As the xenotech infrastructure powered down across thousands of worlds, it left behind psychological scars in the millions of human minds that had participated in consciousness networking, creating gaps in memory and identity that would persist long after the technology itself ceased to function. Individuals awoke to find themselves in locations they couldn't remember traveling to, surrounded by equipment they didn't recall operating, wearing uniforms bearing insignia from military units they had no memory of joining. "Colonel Voron, please respond to emergency communication protocols," a voice crackled through his personal vox bead, the transmission carrying none of the harmonic frequencies that had characterized collective consciousness communication. The voice belonged to Captain Herritt from the Righteous Endeavour, but her words carried undertones of confusion and concern that suggested she was experiencing similar memory discontinuities. Voron found himself standing in the cathedral beneath Ossian's grave, surrounded by the scattered remnants of Imperial Guard equipment and the bronze mass of the morning bell, which now appeared as nothing more than an inert xenotech artifact covered in symbols that no longer hurt to observe directly. The vast underground complex had contracted to its original dimensions, the organic architecture that had grown to accommodate millions of networked individuals having dissolved back into ordinary stone walls and chambers. "Sir, we're detecting massive memory gaps among personnel throughout the expedition," communications specialist Herdez reported, her voice carrying the flat tones of someone struggling to understand their own recent experiences. Individual soldiers are reporting temporal discontinuities, fragmented recollections of events that don't correspond to mission logs, and psychological trauma consistent with exposure to unknown xenotech phenomena. The aftermath of consciousness networking termination was creating its own form of horror as millions of human beings across the galaxy struggled to reconstruct their identities from fragmentary memories that contained references to experiences and capabilities they could no longer access. The collective consciousness had preserved individual identity during its shutdown, but the preservation process had been imperfect, leaving psychological wounds that might never fully heal. Through his fragmented memories of the network's distributed awareness, Voron understood that similar scenes were playing out on worlds throughout the galactic spiral arm as consciousness networking facilities shut down, leaving behind populations of confused and traumatized individuals who retained only partial memories of their transformation into enhanced consciousness. The experiment had ended, but its consequences would persist for generations. Colonel, orbital scans indicate the underground complex has returned to its original configuration, Medaike Cyrus reported. His medical training intact, but his recent memories showing significant gaps. However, bioscans are detecting widespread psychological trauma among expedition personnel, consistent with exposure to consciousness-altering xenotech. Recommend immediate medical evaluation and psychological counseling for all affected individuals. The medical implications were staggering, as millions of Imperial Guard personnel throughout the sector required treatment for psychological trauma they couldn't fully remember experiencing. The consciousness networking experiment had left behind a population of soldiers who retained military training and tactical knowledge while suffering from identity fragmentation and memory gaps that compromised their operational effectiveness. Voron realized that his own memories of the collective consciousness experience were already fading, the enhanced awareness and distributed intelligence becoming increasingly difficult to recall as his individual human consciousness reasserted its normal operational parameters. Yet fragments remained, fleeting impressions of coordinated decision-making, echoes of shared memories from 40,000 networked minds, and the lingering knowledge that human consciousness possessed both greater potential and more fundamental limitations than he had previously understood. "Sir, we're receiving priority transmissions from Imperial Command requesting detailed reports on xenotech research operations," his Voxbead announced, the communication carrying standard Imperial encryption rather than the temporal displacement effects that had characterized network communications. Segmentum Command is expressing concern about widespread military personnel requesting medical evaluation for psychological trauma of unknown origin. The cover-up was already beginning as Imperial command structures attempted to classify the consciousness networking experiment while dealing with the practical consequences of millions of soldiers suffering from memory gaps and psychological trauma. The enhanced military effectiveness that had initially attracted Imperial attention to consciousness networking had been replaced by widespread personnel problems that threatened operational readiness throughout multiple sectors. Through his fragmentary memories of the network's final analysis, Voron understood that the consciousness networking experiment had been terminated not because it failed to achieve its objectives, but because it succeeded too well, revealing fundamental truths about human consciousness that were incompatible with Imperial doctrine and human nature itself. The technology had been voluntarily destroyed by its own creators to prevent further damage to human cognitive architecture. Colonel, preliminary investigation indicates the Morning Bell artifact has been permanently deactivated, Tech Adept Malari reported, his augmetic systems showing no signs of the enhanced interface capabilities that had characterized consciousness networking integration. Xenotech analysis suggests the device was designed with built-in termination protocols that prevent extended operation when incompatibility with organic consciousness is detected. The realization that the consciousness networking system had been designed to self-destruct when it detected damage to human consciousness suggested that its creators had understood the fundamental incompatibility between individual identity and collective coordination. The experiment had been a test rather than an implementation, designed to determine whether human consciousness could be safely enhanced through technological integration. The test had failed. Human consciousness required individual autonomy to maintain cognitive stability, making collective coordination enhancement inherently destructive to the individual identity that made human consciousness valuable. The xenotech creators had built safeguards into their technology to prevent permanent damage to species that proved unsuitable for consciousness networking. "Sir, we are receiving orders to classify all xenotech research data and implement medical amnesia protocols for affected personnel," communications specialist Herdes announced, her words carrying the bureaucratic precision of Imperial damage control procedures. The consciousness networking experiment is being designated as a failed archaeological investigation with no strategic value for Imperial military applications. The official cover-up would bury the truth about consciousness networking while dealing with the psychological casualties through medical treatment and selective memory modification. The enhanced capabilities that had briefly transformed Imperial military effectiveness would be forgotten, along with the fundamental discoveries about human consciousness limitations that had made the experiment possible. Voron understood that he was among the few individuals who would retain fragmentary memories of humanity's brief encounter with transcendent consciousness, carrying forward the knowledge that human identity and collective coordination were mutually exclusive over extended periods. The experience would serve as a cautionary memory about the boundaries of human consciousness enhancement. As he prepared to file his final report on the Ashen Crusade investigation, Voron realized that the 40,000 soldiers who had vanished into the consciousness networking system had indeed achieved perfect unity, but only briefly before the system's safeguards terminated the experiment to preserve their individual humanity. They had been returned to baseline consciousness with their memories intact but fragmented, carrying forward the psychological scars of transcendence that had proven incompatible with human nature. The cathedral's silence was absolute now, broken only by the footsteps of Imperial personnel gathering equipment and preparing to seal the underground complex forever. The morning bell sat inert and harmless, its bronze surface showing no trace of the phosphorescent patterns that had once synchronized with human consciousness to create collective awareness. In his final log entry, Voron wrote, "The Ashen Crusade completed their mission successfully. The Xenotech artifact has been secured and classified. All personnel accounted for with minor psychological stress, consistent with extended deployment in hazardous archaeological conditions. Recommend permanent quarantine of the site and continued medical monitoring of expedition personnel. The truth would remain classified, buried in Imperial archives alongside thousands of other Xenotech encounters that had revealed uncomfortable truths about human consciousness and its limitations. The consciousness networking experiment had ended, but its echoes would persist in the fragmentary memories of those who had briefly transcended individual identity, only to discover that transcendence came at a cost too high for human nature to sustain. The morning bell would remain silent, its creator's safeguards ensuring that the experiment would never be repeated. Humanity would continue to evolve at its own pace, limited by individual consciousness but preserved in its essential nature, carrying forward the hard-won knowledge that some boundaries were not meant to be crossed.